Hello, everyone. Thank you for being back after lunch. We're going to start the second part of our symposium today. The next conversation, I'm going to have a conversation with Mariam Merzouga, who is an ex-FLN militant who was based in Paris during most of the Algerian Revolution, starting from 1957 to 1962 when she returned in Algeria. We are going to do something similar to what we did with Safia early on today, is go through pictures and images and ask Mariam to take us through her journey as a militant. And it's a little special for me to be presenting this here because Mariam is also my mother. So, voilà. So Mariam, can you come please with us? Alors, bonjour, bienvenue Mariam, bienvenue à Brown University. Je vais juste faire une toute petite introduction en anglais, et puis ensuite on va discuter en français pendant la conversation. Okay. So we have this is going to go back and forth between sort of personal history and personal journey. And the historical moment that these women, Safia early on today and Mariam now, were active participants in. So here we want to step back just a little bit earlier, before the Algerian Revolution, very quickly, to be in the Kasbah of Algiers, where Mariam grew up, where Safia grew up, and sort of look at life at that very moment between the end of the French rule, the beginning of the war, and then a little bit later taking us all the way to independence. There are three pictures that you can see on the screen right now. That little child that you see standing is about 5 years old and is now slightly older and staying with us today. This photograph is taken in the Kasbah of Algiers. It has to be in the early 40s, and from what I understand, this is one of the earliest photos of Kwasi that I know. So Kwasi took that picture of Mariam. So we're at this point where, we looked at the sort of like historical side of, the work of Kwasi, but it's also crossed with something intimate, like we saw with Safia in the photograph, and now with Mariam. So we have this photo in the Kasbah of Algiers. The photo on the top right corner is Mariam a few years later, again a photo by Kwasi. This time it's in the basement of the mosque, the Paris mosque, after she had to leave Algeria to hide in plain sight, I would say, in France during the war. And then the group of photographs that you see at the bottom, this is family. This is family before revolution, this is family during revolution, and this is the sort of like roman of a bourgeois family in Algiers and in the Kasbah at the time. Voilà. So, merci. Alors, pour commencer, est-ce que tu peux nous dire quelques mots sur cette grande photo de cette petite fille dans la Kasbah au début des années 40, qui c'est, et un peu le contexte de cette photographie, s'il te plaît.
Oui, là je me retrouve dans la maison où je suis née. Et c'est une photo qui a été prise par Kwasi. D'ailleurs, il y en a eu beaucoup, parce que c'était à Alger. Il prenait énormément de photos, il adorait ça. Et je suis née dans une grande maison à la Kasbah, le 25 janvier 1938. Et j'ai grandi jusqu'à 19... Je suis restée à la Kasbah, enfin, j'ai grandi à la Kasbah, entourée d'une grande famille. Mes grands-parents, mes parents, mes oncles, mes tantes. Parce qu'avant, on vivait en famille. Comme la maison était grande, chacun avait une part de son... Et on vivait tous ensemble. C'était très important. Et... Donc...
Safia dit jusqu'en 57. Ouais.
Oui, 57. Oui, c'est vrai. Voilà. Heureusement que tu es là.
Il y a justement... Actually, Asia, would you want to... Sorry, go ahead. Okay. Il y a parce qu'il y a ces deux photos, justement, ce que Safia vient de dire. La photo...
La première, oui. La première, c'est quand je devais avoir 5 ans à ce moment-là. C'est une photo à la Kasbah. Et la deuxième, c'était à Paris. J'étais en train de me laver les cheveux et Kwasi était là en train de dire « Tourne-toi, mets la tête, regarde, baisse les yeux, truc ». Ça a duré 20 minutes et à un moment donné, je lui dis « Écoute, ça suffit, laisse-moi me laver les cheveux ». Et c'est là où il a pris tout de suite la photo parce qu'il a saisi le moment qu'il fallait. Donc, comme il commençait à truc, et on s'était marré. Donc, c'est... Et ce qui est en dessous, c'est toute la famille. Toute la famille. Toutes les photos de la famille, des parents, des grands-parents, des cousins, des tantes, tous, même Safia est là. Elle est toujours...
Safia est tout en bas sur ce portrait this portrait that you can see at the bottom of that picture of the family. C'est une bonne photo de toi, Safia, qu'on voit.
So the first photo takes me back to my childhood and to the house I was born in. I was born on the 25th of January 1938 and grew up in the Kasbah, only left in 57 to go meet Safia in Paris, where the second photo was taken in the basement of the mosque in Paris, and I was washing my hair and Kwasi was there and wanting to take my picture and directing me all of these ways, look up, look down, your eyes, this way, until I had enough of it and I told him to let me wash my hair, which is when he finally took the photo, and we laughed a lot about it. And the picture below that is the entire family, and so in the house in which we grew up, which is where the first photo comes from, we were always extremely surrounded. These are very large houses where the entire family lived together, which was very important, and these are photos then of these family members.
Et ce que je voudrais demander maintenant, la raison pour laquelle j'ai mis ces trois photos ensemble, c'est qu'il y a une cassure qui se passe entre la première photo de Kwasi qui a été prise quand tu es enfant dans la Casbah, et ensuite cette photo quelques années plus tard qui se passe en France, donc de l'autre côté de la Méditerranée, oui. Et la famille au milieu. Est-ce que tu peux raconter comment on passe de cette photo de l'enfant à cette photo de la jeune femme?
Oui, donc dans cette photo, bien sûr, j'ai vécu à la Casbah, j'ai grandi, j'ai fait mes études. Et tout se passait très bien parce que je redis toujours, on était vraiment une famille unie et on était heureux. On était heureux parce qu'on était gâtés par les tantes, par les oncles, par les amis. Mais malheureusement, en 1er novembre 1954,
début de l'insurrection, début de la révolution.
La révolution, à l'époque j'étais étudiante, donc j'étais au lycée encore, j'avais 16 ans, et je me suis dit il faut que je fasse quelque chose, parce que notre famille, c'était une famille bourgeoise, mais une famille intellectuelle et militante. Tout le monde, mes oncles, mes tantes, tout le monde était milité pour le... Et donc, comme je ne savais pas ce qu'il fallait faire, etc., j'avais un parent qui avait déjà dans une cellule et qui me dit, voilà, tu vas broder des fanions pour mettre sur les habits des gens qui sont au maquis, les militaires. Et donc, en revenant du lycée, je m'enfermais dans ma chambre et je brodais ces petits fanions. Je ne sais pas, j'en ai dû faire peut-être 300, 500, peut-être plus, je ne me rappelle pas. Mais c'était des nuits entières où je faisais ça et j'étais très heureuse parce que tout d'un coup, j'étais révolutionnaire à cet âge-là, vous vous rendez compte. Et ça a duré 1 an. En 1955, on m'a dit, oui, mais maintenant, il faut faire autre chose. C'est-à-dire être agent de liaison avec la cellule avec qui je travaillais, et c'est-à-dire pour sortir des documents, de les remettre à des personnes pour les utiliser, etc. Et donc, c'est ce que je faisais. Il fallait tous les jours, en sortant... Alors là, j'étais carrément au lycée, et en sortant du lycée, je passais à la cellule, je prenais les documents, et j'allais retrouver les personnes à qui je devais les remettre, qui attendaient, qui rejoignaient le maquis. Et c'est ce que j'ai fait pendant ce temps-là. Mais seulement, on n'avait pas le droit d'en parler à personne, ni aux parents, ni aux trucs, parce qu'il suffisait qu'on sache quelque chose et qu'une arrestation se fasse, etc. Donc, mes parents ne savaient pas. Mes parents, j'étais au lycée. Comme j'étais toujours de bonne humeur, je racontais des histoires, je voulais faire du théâtre, c'était comme ça. Alors, ils n'ont jamais pensé que je faisais cela, que j'avais commencé à travailler avec l'organisation. Et ça...
Tu veux y aller?
Oui.
So as I said, in this first picture, it takes me back to my youth growing up and going to school. We were a very united, very close-knit family and very happy because we were spoiled or cherished by all of the uncles and the aunts. And it was quite a bourgeois family, but also a very intellectual family, and political activism was a big part of it as well. So that when the 1st of November 1954 occurred, with the beginning of the uprising, I knew I was 16 at the time, and I knew that I had to take part one way or another. And so, guided by a family member who had already integrated a cell, I was given a job, which made me very happy because at that age I was already a revolutionary. Where after school, I was in high school at the time, I would go back to my room and sew together the armbands of the soldiers in the maquis, in the underground. So I did this sewing work for the armbands for the soldiers for about a year. And in 1955, the nature of my missions were changed, where I became a liaison officer, where I was transferring documents. So from then on, after school, I would go and pick up documents that I would have to go and hand over to somebody else that was going to take them back to the maquis. And all of this happened in complete silence. I didn't tell my parents about any of it. I was a very joyful young person. I had dreams of the theater. They had no idea that I was already working with the organization.
Il y a un basculement, un moment.
Oui.
Okay.
Début 55, j'avais eu mon bac, j'étais contente. J'ai passé la journée avec les copines, on fêtait ça. Je suis passée à la fac de droit à Alger pour retirer mon dossier pour m'inscrire en droit, parce qu'il fallait faire des études si je voulais faire du théâtre. Et je rentrais chez moi, mais alors, c'était le 14 juillet. Je rentrais chez moi toute contente, et en me disant, parce qu'à ce moment-là, on était toujours enfants, même en ayant 16 ans, 17 ans, 18 ans, il y avait ce côté, parce qu'il y avait la famille autour. Et je me disais, on va aller voir le feu d'artifice du 14 juillet. Parce que tous les ans, on allait faire le bord le boulevard et voir le feu d'artifice. Et je rentre chez moi, je vois ma mère qui me dit, écoute, il y a ton père qui veut te parler. Il va rentrer, il doit te parler. Donc, j'attends mon père avec impatience, en se disant, c'est pour me dire, préparez-vous, nous allons sortir. Et mon père me dit, viens, j'ai quelque chose à te demander. Est-ce que tu travailles avec l'organisation? Je lui dis, mais pas du tout, papa. Tu vois, je suis au lycée, je viens d'avoir mon bac. Il me dit, non, dis-moi la vérité. Et après, il me dit, bon, on avait un commissariat en face de la maison où on habitait.
Dans la basse Casbah.
La basse Casbah, c'était le quartier vers le bas. Et le commissaire connaissait toute la famille, mes grands-parents, mes parents, etc. Et mon père rentrait à la maison, il lui avait dit, venez, j'ai quelque chose à vous dire. Et là, il lui a dit, voilà, votre fille doit partir ce soir, doit quitter l'Algérie aujourd'hui. Et excusez-moi.
Non. Tu veux qu'elle commence à traduire? Elle va commencer à traduire.
Et donc, il me dit, voilà ce qu'il y a, voilà ce que le commissaire m'a dit, et tu vas partir. Et je dis, mais papa, je reviens. Il me dit, non, tu pars, il faut que tu pars ce soir. Et le commissaire avait fait un laissez-passer, parce que c'était la nuit à 10h du soir, il avait fait un laissez-passer. Il m'avait donné une carte d'identité, parce que moi j'avais juste une carte scolaire, j'avais pas de carte d'identité. Et il a dit à mon père, écoutez, vous avez votre sœur et votre belle-sœur qui sont une à Paris, l'autre en Bretagne. Laissez-la partir. Si vraiment, parce que demain, il y aura les parachutistes à la maison. Et ils vont arrêter tout le monde. Et ils sont là pour les arrêter. Et il lui dit, s'il n'y a rien, si c'est une fausse nouvelle, donc on la fera revenir dans une semaine, dans 2 jours, il n'y a aucun problème. Et mon père me dit ça, il me dit voilà, etc. Bon. Et je me prépare. Donc, et puis là, il ne fallait pas dire à la famille que je partais. Personne, mes cousines, ma mère, personne ne savait que je partais. Et mon père, discrètement, il me dit, tu prépares juste un petit truc de rien du tout et on sort. Et donc, comme tout le monde dormait, parce que l'avion, c'était un brevet de pont qui partait d'Alger, qui faisait escale à Marseille, qui repartait après sur Paris. C'était toute une aventure. Et il partait très tard, je crois que c'était à minuit ou quelque chose comme ça. Et donc tout le monde est rentré se reposer en pensant que ça allait bien. Et moi, je pars à 10h30, 11h du soir. Mon père m'accompagne à l'aéroport. Et je monte dans cet avion. Et j'arrive à Paris. Donc c'est comme ça que je...
Et on va laisser Assia reprendre à partir de là.
So early in 1955, I get my high school degree, and so we're celebrating. It's the 14th of July, and I just go by the law school where I was getting the paperwork to apply, because to be able to work in the theater, I also needed to get a good education. And at the time, even being 16, 17, or 18, we were still children, in part because of the large family surrounding. There was a kind of joyfulness about it. We were planning to go and see the fireworks for the 14th of July, as we did every year on the seafront. And I go home and my mother tells me that my father needs to speak to me. And so I go and see him, and he asks me whether I work with the organization. And I say, no, not at all. And he tells me not to lie to him. And so we lived in this house in the lower Kasbah, across the street from which there was a police station. And this police officer had come and seen my father, and told him that I worked for the organization, and told him that I needed to leave Algeria that very night. Under threat of the paratroopers coming to arrest us all tomorrow. And so I was told that I needed to leave there and then. The police officer gave me the paperwork necessary for my departure, as well as a state ID, because up until now I had only had a school card. And the idea was that if all of this was a kind of an idle threat of the paratroopers, I would be able to come back a week later or a few days later. And so my father told me to pack a very small bag. I couldn't tell anyone that I was leaving, my cousins, my aunts, or anyone. And the plane was leaving very late, around midnight. It was a small plane that went from Algiers to Marseille into Paris. It was a whole adventure. So my father drove me at 10:30, 11 at night, when everybody had gone to rest, thinking everything was fine. And I was put on this plane, and I arrived in Paris the next day.
I have just a quick question, une question très rapide, une réponse très rapide. C'était 1957. Quand est-ce que tu es rentré en Algérie la fois d'après?
En 62.
Donc pendant 5 ans. So she left Paris, she left Algeria that day in 1957, and the next time she saw Algeria, it was in 1962. Okay, so on est à Paris. Est-ce que tu peux nous raconter le travail que tu fais à Paris pendant ces quelques années, j'ai envie de dire rapidement, je suis désolé, oui. Mais très succinctement, tout ce que tu as fait de 57 à 62 à Paris. Donne-nous juste une idée de ce parcours et de quelle était l'atmosphère de cette époque à Paris.
Oui, c'est-à-dire, dès que je suis arrivée, 48 heures après, il y a des personnes qui m'ont contactée. Et moi, ça me faisait peur. Je me disais, peut-être que c'est des gens qui sont envoyés d'Alger et qui essayent de me coincer pour pouvoir faire du mal à mes parents. Parce que le lendemain de mon départ, les parachutistes étaient à la maison. Ils ont arrêté mes oncles, mon père. Mais le plus dur, c'était qu'il y avait ce qu'on appelait ceux qui trahissaient leur pays. Il y avait ce qu'on les appelait les bleus. C'était des types masqués qui avaient pris une maison pas loin de la Casbah. Et le responsable de ces personnes-là, des ordures, c'était quelqu'un qui avait un lien de parenté avec mon grand-père. Et mon grand-père l'a toujours rejeté en disant c'est un voyou, etc. Et les parachutistes ont fait leur problème, leur travail, pardon. Ils ont regardé, ils ont visité les pièces, les chambres, les lits, les armoires et tout ça.
Excuse-moi, et ça, en fait, ce que tu racontes là, c'est à Alger. C'est-à-dire qu'une fois que tu es parti, les parachutistes sont arrivés à Alger, dans la maison de famille.
Et donc, le lendemain, j'ai essayé d'avoir des nouvelles. Effectivement, tout le monde a été arrêté. Et personne ne savait ce qui s'était passé. Et à partir de là, j'avais peur que mes parents, ma famille à Alger ait des problèmes et tout. Finalement, je disais, vous savez, moi, je suis venue pour aller voir ma tante en Normandie, donc je ne peux pas, etc. Et puis, il y a quelqu'un un jour qui m'a contacté. Il m'a dit, écoutez, voilà, nous avons... Parce qu'au début de la Révolution, les détenus algériens étaient de droit commun. Et la Fédération de France a décidé que ce soit des politiques, des droits politiques. Parce qu'il y avait un collectif d'avocats qui a été organisé.
Autour de qui? Quelques noms qui faisaient partie de ce collectif?
Alors, il y avait Maître Oussedik, un très très bon avocat algérien, Maître Ben Abdallah, il y avait Maître Vergès, Il y avait, ça c'est les 3 principaux, mais il y avait d'autres avocats qui étaient en province. Il y avait Zabrian, il y avait une avocate que j'aimais beaucoup, Maître Bolib. Attends, hier il m'avait dit...
Il y a beaucoup de noms. Il y a beaucoup de noms. Asia va traduire ça, ok?
C'est lui qui sait.
So when I arrived...
Hein? Beauvillard, voilà. Maître Beauvillard. Qui était
Merci Olivier.
Voilà, parce qui était une femme exceptionnelle, une avocate formidable.
So 48 hours after my arrival in Paris, I was contacted by somebody from the organization, but I was... I rejected these calls for a long time because I was afraid that they were really traps that could harm my family, because the paratroopers indeed did come and arrest everyone the day after my departure. They arrested my father, they arrested my uncles. And there was an organization of people who were a masked organization that we called the Blues, who were, functioning traitors, really horrible people, of whom the leader was related to my grandfather, and my grandfather had always renounced him and didn't want to have anything to do with him. So because of this hostile situation in Algeria, in Algiers, following my departure, the first contacts that I had with the organization in Paris, I was suspicious of as being possible traps. And I said not at all, that I was just here to visit my aunt in Normandy. And so at that time, we didn't know what had happened to our family members. But thanks to the work of really brilliant lawyers, including... the ones that
Vergès, Oussaddir, Abdallah.
Samahan and the prisoners, the Algerian prisoners, went from being considered as being under common law to functioning under a system of political prisoners. And then...
Et en fait, pour expliquer de manière concrète et à travers les photographies une partie du travail que tu faisais, est-ce que tu peux nous expliquer ce que sont ces photos que j'ai mis derrière toi? Donc tu es dans chacune de ces photos et quel est le travail que tu effectuais et qui sont ces hommes?
Oui, ça ce sont les 5 chefs de la Révolution qui ont été arrêtés par leur avion a été détourné sur Alger. Ils étaient au Maroc, ils partaient en Tunisie, et leur avion a été détourné sur Alger. Et c'est comme ça qu'ils ont été arrêtés en Algérie. Et
tu peux nous dire les noms qu'on voit? On voit Mohamed Boudiaf,
Il y a Mohamed Boudiaf, il y a Aït Ahmed, Hossein Aït Ahmed, il y a Bitat, il y a Mohamed Khidr, il y a Ahmed Ben Bella. Voilà. Il
y a Boudiaf, oui, je l'avais dit, on ne l'oublie pas.
Oui. Donc il y avait les 5 qui étaient là. Quand ils les ont arrêtés dans l'avion, il y avait un historien qui était le Chabab, qui était un type formidable.
Redis son nom, s'il te plaît, l'historien.
C'est le Chabab, hein?
Ouais.
Mais il ne faisait pas partie des trucs. Donc une fois arrivé, parce que De Gaulle avait demandé à ce que les détenus soient transférés tout de suite en France, parce qu'il avait peur que l'OAS les assassine. Donc ils ont été transférés à Fresnes. Et le Chabab a été renvoyé, il a pu rentrer en Algérie dans sa famille. Donc, et c'est Bitat qui a pris sa place, parce qu'il faisait l'un des chefs historiques. Et ils étaient à l'île d'Aix d'abord. Et je suis allée une fois, la première fois où je devais aller voir avec Maître Sédic, on ne m'a pas donné de permis pour entrer. Et après, ils ont été libérés, ils ont été à Fresnes, à la Santé, pardon. Et après, ils ont été transférés à Turcan. Turcan, c'est dans la Loire.
C'est dans la Loire.
C'était un grand château ancien, avec un grand parc, etc. Et donc, ils étaient tous là-bas. Et c'est comme ça que j'allais pratiquement tous les week-ends pour avoir tous les documents, les trucs, ce qu'ils écrivent, parce qu'ils étaient toujours en contact. Et on leur a donné aussi toutes les informations, ce qui se passait à Paris, ce qui se passait en France, par la Fédération de France, enfin, tous les documents qu'on avait. Les avocats donnaient pour les détenus. On avait la Fédération de France qui donnait des documents à remettre aux 5.
Il y a une question que je me do you want to go? Ouais.
So these pictures are the pictures in which Miriam is in every single frame, with the 5 leaders of the revolution that were arrested in Algeria after a flight was détourné, hijacked.
Hijacked.
Even without. Okay.
Really hijacked.
Hijacked. So the flight was hijacked on its way from Morocco to Tunisia to land in Algiers, where the men were arrested. And de Gaulle, because he was afraid that the OAS might assassinate them, asked that they be brought back to France very promptly, which they were. And so at first, they were incarcerated at l'Île d'Aix, then transferred to la Prison de la Santé in Paris, and then in Turcan, which is in the Pays de Loire, where it was a region with a lot of huge castles, including this prison, which was a large castle with a very large garden, where I would go and visit them basically every weekend to deliver information and to get documents from them and keep them informed. All of this under the auspices of the Fédération française.
Alors, la question que je voulais poser, j'étais en train de regarder l'heure. Je suis vraiment désolé d'être celui qui regarde l'heure. C'est une question qui est, à mon avis, une réponse un peu longue, mais moi, ce qui m'intéresse aujourd'hui aussi, c'est de connaître un peu les relations entre ces 5 pendant cette détention, mais je pense qu'il n'y a pas le temps. Mais alors, ce que je voudrais par contre savoir, c'est il y a cette idée que pendant qu'ils sont en détention en France, ils sont un peu hors jeu, c'est-à-dire que les décisions se prennent ailleurs, etc. Mais qu'est-ce que c'est ce va-et-vient entre les informations qui vont vers eux, les informations qui sortent? Donc, ils restent d'une certaine façon dans cette conversation et dans ce mouvement, mais en même temps, ils sont aussi en partie hors jeu. Tu peux décrire juste ça 2 minutes?
Oui, parce qu'ils étaient complètement isolés. Donc, si vous voulez, quand on leur... moi, je partais le vendredi soir et je rentrais le dimanche matin. Donc, on leur donnait d'abord les détenus, dans quelles conditions ils sont, parce qu'ils étaient très intéressés par ça, que ce soit comment ça se passe. La Fédération de France donnait des documents à leur remettre aussi, pour savoir comment les choses, comment vont, etc. Et donc, ils avaient besoin de cette... et puis des discussions. On avait des discussions. Moi, je prenais toujours une demi-heure avec chacun pour pouvoir parler, voir ce dont ils ont besoin, leur raconter, parce qu'il y a certaines choses qui ne sont pas écrites, donc leur expliquer. Et
est-ce que leur voix portait hors du château? Est-ce qu'ils avaient une influence sur les décisions qui étaient prises, ou est-ce qu'on les gardait juste
Non, aucune. C'était c'est beaucoup plus tard, je crois 2 ans après, 2 ou 3 ans après, il y avait des personnes qui ont pu venir les voir, parce qu'avant c'était très fermé. Ils n'avaient pas de visite ni rien, mais il y a eu par exemple Ben Yahya qui est venu, c'est un très grand ministre qui est venu les voir. Il y a
ministre du GPR.
Oui, donc ils avaient, et puis petit à petit, ils commençaient à avoir certaines nouvelles, pas toutes les nouvelles, mais et puis les familles, par exemple, Hirak recevait sa femme, ses beaux-parents, il restait avec eux pendant 15 jours, 1 mois dans le château pour pouvoir rester avec leur père, leurs enfants, etc. On les voit sur cette photo d'ailleurs. Ben Bella n'avait pas de visite, Hirak non plus, pas Hirak avait sa famille, Bitat, Boudia et Haït n'avaient pas de visite. Ils ne recevaient pas. Donc ça leur permettait de parler. Quelquefois on parlait de théâtre, on parlait qu'est-ce qui se passe en France, les manifestations, quand il y avait des... Donc ils étaient intéressés parce qu'ils voulaient vraiment tout savoir. Et comment se présentent les frères, est-ce qu'ils ont des problèmes, est-ce que vous êtes bien protégés. Enfin c'était toujours les mêmes questions et ça leur faisait du bien. Donc et puis quelquefois on plaisantait, on parlait de cinéma, de théâtre, des petites choses de rien du tout pour pouvoir libérer un peu Mais tous les 5 étaient formidables. Sincèrement, ils étaient très unis. Il y avait une association, c'était des...
On va la laisser Hedi pour que je connais cette
voilà.
histoire. Go ahead, Asia.
So the question was about whether the influx of information was just toward the men who were in detention, or whether they actually got to weigh in on certain conversations in Algeria or in the movement. And the answer was that they didn't. It was very much about keeping them informed. And so she would go on Friday evenings until Sunday mornings. And for a few years, there were no visits, which eventually opened up. Ministers from the provisional government came to visit, and then certain family members would come and stay for a prolonged amount of time, as we see on this photo there. And they wanted to know about everything that was happening, about general news, about the movement, but also about French politics, and then also about theater and cinema, and just having that contact to the information was very important to them, and they were extremely united and quite formidable individually as well.
I'm going to jump to this last slide. I want to ask. Alors, celle-ci non. Parce que comme elles sont prises en France, c'est pas lui, c'est pas Kwasi qui prend ces photos-là.
Non.
Non. Qui prend ces photos-là?
Il y avait des amis qui étaient là, ils prenaient des photos sur place. Et ils adoraient les photos. Aït Ahmed n'aimait pas les photos, donc on ne le voit pas, on n'a pas sur aucune photo, mais Khidr adorait les photos.
Et c'est intéressant et important, en fait c'est des photos de famille.
Oui,
voilà, c'est des photos qui sont dans l'album de famille chez toi.
Oui, parce qu'à l'époque, personne n'allait les voir, les premières années. Donc quand on arrivait là, on prenait des photos, on discutait, etc. Et après, c'est-à-dire avant le cessez-le-feu, 1 an avant, ça commençait un peu à se libérer. Donc il y avait des personnes qui pouvaient venir, des politiques, il y avait qui pouvaient discuter. Donc ça leur donnait un peu d'air, quoi, de l'extérieur. Et puis il y avait une association. Ah oui.
Après, on l'a dit. I'm censoring. No, I'm kidding. Je voudrais juste rajouter quelque chose sur ces images. Et ça, c'est une intersection, moi, qui m'intéresse. I'll say it in English, actually. So the question that Ariela was asking was, did Kwasi take these pictures, right? And the answer is no. But these are family photos. So that means that I've seen these photos since I was a child in a book, in our home in Paris where I grew up. And at one point they made sense differently when confronting them to other images and to other stories and to other histories, including Kwasi, when suddenly there was this intersection between the private journey, between the personal journey, and between the history itself. And I think that connection, that intersection, I think that's something that Jem'a brought up, in a different way, right? Is something also that I think many of us are dealing with and are working with as we work with these topics that are part biographical and part purely a material for research. So these photos themselves, I think, are a really interesting example of that give you sort of like this historical, quote-unquote figures, Ben Bella, Boudiaf, etc. And at the same time, they're family photos. That's also what they are. And I think there's something there that is really interesting. That's sort of like fleeting. Voilà. So, je te traduirai ça tout à l'heure. I'll jump to just this because I know time is flying. La question avec laquelle aussi on voulait finir, parce qu'on est quand même sur l'indépendance, tout ce programme qu'on organise, ça c'est les photos de Kwasi, c'est l'indépendance, le 5 juillet à Alger, autour du 5 juillet à Alger. Est-ce que tu peux nous raconter ton retour, qui n'est pas à Alger le 5 juillet, mais ton retour en Algérie et quel est ton ressenti quand tu retournes dans ton pays après être parti de 57 à 62, quand en 57 à 19 ans, en 62, voilà, c'est 5 ans plus tard et tu retournes là. Tu peux nous raconter comment tu es rentré et quel était le sentiment à l'époque?
Oui, c'est-à-dire quand il y a eu le cessez-le-feu, on a décidé de libérer bien sûr les 5 détenus. Et le jour la veille de la libération, le vendredi, donc j'étais là-bas et je devais rentrer avec eux. On devait rentrer Et on a appris qu'il y avait l'OAS qui avait préparé un piège pour pouvoir les descendre quand ils sortaient de Turcan. Et à ce moment-là, il fallait... Donc c'était par la présidence qui avait dit il y a un danger, donc il faut faire très attention. Et là, on me dit, bon, ce qu'on va faire, il y avait le conseiller du roi du Maroc qui venait souvent pour avoir des nouvelles, etc., était venu. Et puis on me dit, bon, écoute, ce qu'on va faire, comme il y avait beaucoup de journalistes autour du château, tu vas rentrer avec lui. Comme ça, les journalistes vont vous suivre. Les gens, si vraiment il y a des gens dangereux, ils vont penser que c'est nous. Donc, comme il y aura plein de journalistes, ils ne feront rien. Et nous, on sort juste après. Et c'est ce qui s'est passé en me disant, on t'appellera dès qu'on sera sur place. Et donc, ils sont rentrés. On est rentrés sur Paris. Et eux, ils sont rentrés sur Genève. Donc, ils devaient partir, pas Genève, en Suisse en tout cas. Et bon, pendant longtemps, 2-3 jours, il n'y a pas eu de nouvelles, etc. Et puis après, on m'a dit, bon, il y a beaucoup de travail, on est en train de faire des choses, à Tripoli et tout ça. Et ça a duré pendant, je crois que c'était pendant 3 semaines, 1 mois à peu près. Et un jour, j'avais un ami aussi qui était à Paris, qui était un dessinateur, qui s'appelait Bob Siné, qui était l'ami de Vergès. Il me téléphone en me disant, écoute, il faut que tu passes, il y a quelqu'un qui veut te voir. Donc je passe chez lui et je vois Vergès, qui était déjà au Maroc depuis longtemps. Il était parti. Et il me dit, voilà, il faut que demain, tu prends ton passeport et tu viens tu rejoins le Maroc, on t'attend. Je dis oui, mais il m'a dit, voilà, c'est les consignes, compris les 5. Donc, je ne suis pas rentrée directement sur Alger. J'ai laissé mes affaires à quelqu'un pour me les emmener. Et j'ai pris au Maroc jusqu'à...
Rabat. Rabat. Jusqu'à Rabat.
Rabat, oui. Ouais. J'allais dire Oujda. Jusqu'à Rabat.
Et ensuite Oujda.
Et il y avait un ami des 5 d'ailleurs. C'était un ami de Ben Bella, mais c'était aussi l'ami de tous. C'était le docteur Khatib, qui était un ministre de la défense, de la santé, etc., qui était un type qui vivait au Maroc et qui venait souvent. Et donc j'étais chez lui, on a passé dans sa famille, et le lendemain il fallait que je reprenne la route pour aller rentrer sur Tlemcen, parce qu'il y avait la constitution du bureau politique à Tlemcen, et il fallait que je rejoigne tout ça à la villa Rivaux. Et donc je prends le train jusqu'à la frontière, et c'est Bouteflika qui vient me chercher pour me faire passer la frontière de Oujda sur Marnia. Et de Marnia, on est arrivé sur Tlemcen. Et c'est comme ça que j'ai rejoint la Villa Rivaux. Il y avait tout le monde qui était là-bas, qui organisaient le bureau politique.
Quelques noms, tout le monde parce que
il y avait Boumediene qui était là, il y avait certains ministres qui étaient, enfin, des militants qui étaient là aussi, il y avait des journalistes qui étaient arrivés, enfin, il y avait tout un tas de monde qui venait, etc. Et beaucoup d'étrangers qui voulaient savoir ce qui s'était passé. Donc, alors, il y avait Khedr, il y avait Bembella, et il y avait Haït était resté à Alger. Et donc, c'était vraiment on n'arrêtait pas, c'était sans arrêt. Il y avait des gens qui venaient, des militants qui venaient de Tlemcen, qui venaient et donc, on discutait enfin, on a passé 15 jours là-bas. C'était vraiment le travail 24 heures sur 24. Donc,
on reviendra plus précisément à un autre moment sur le bureau politique à Tlemcen, mais je voudrais qu'Essia puisse traduire, juste rapidement.
So the question was about the return to Algeria. So she left at the age of 19 and came back around the age of 24. And so she was supposed to leave Turcan with the 5 detainees, but on the eve of independence, they got a signal that the OAS had planned a trap to assassinate the men as they would exit the prison. So an intricate ploy was put together with the counselor to the King of Morocco, who often gave visits into the jail. And because there was a lot of press and a lot of journalists around, found that was used as a distraction, and the men were able to exit the prison in this way. And so she went to Paris, and they went to Switzerland at this point. In Paris, she stayed for 3 weeks, waiting to receive some news. There was lots of work and things going on in Tripoli and others. And until one day, a friend and a cartoonist called Bob Siné called her over where she saw Bergès, which was one of the lawyers.
Jacques Bergès.
Yeah. Who told her she was leaving that very night, once again, and so not to Algeria directly, first to Rabat, and then from Rabat to Oujda, and a friend of the, where she stayed with a friend of the five, Dr. Hatib, who was the Minister of Health. And from there, she was supposed to go back to Tlemcen to be there for the constitution of the political bureau by train, where Bouteflika met her at the border and took her to the Villa Ribot, where the constitution of this political bureau was happening, and where they worked tirelessly 24 hours 7 for 2 weeks.
Okay. So I just want to ask something, because we're really running short on time. Do anybody has a question, want to ask a question? Otherwise, I will ask a final question, but please go ahead if you want to ask something. Ouais. Tu veux lui demander en français et on traduira, ce sera plus simple, parce que sinon il faut qu'elle comprenne elle d'abord.
Ouais. Je disais que il y a une anglaise, en fait, une théoricienne qui s'appelle Rose Gray, qui avait parlé des images d'indépendance comme une archive d'espoir et d'aspiration, an archive of aspirations. Et je trouve très intéressant, mais je dis que ce que je voulais dire aussi, c'est qu'il y a une part qui est lumineuse et dans ces images et pleine d'espoir. Il y a aussi une part tragique. Il faut rappeler peut-être pour les gens qui ne savent pas que Mohamed Rider a été tué sous Boumedienne en 67, Boudiab dans les années 90, ensuite à Annaba malheureusement. Donc voilà, il y a à la fois un espoir, et ce qui est intéressant, c'est que ces images, elles montrent un temps d'unité. Et qu'après, il y a cette unité, et il y a eu aussi malheureusement un drame, et je parle même de tragédie, pas de drame. Tragédie au sens où il y a aussi après des dissensions et malheureusement des assassinats. Et c'est très triste de voir qu'en même temps, il y a ces images d'espoir de l'indépendance, d'aspiration populaire. Et donc voici aussi, c'est très important de voir, vous l'avez tous souligné, dans les démarches, cet aspect aussi populaire. C'est qu'il y a à la fois des personnes, et c'est très émouvant ce que vous dites, sur l'intérêt aussi de Ben Bella et d'autres, pour aussi la cause des détenus, de tout le peuple en fait qui était dans cette activité. Mais voilà, je voulais juste dire ça, c'est plutôt notamment, c'était par rapport à ça, c'est qu'il y a une part tragique et que je ne veux pas retirer, et justement par respect pour cette mémoire, et qui est aussi, qui a cette part aussi de lumière et cette part glorieuse. Voilà.
Ariela,
Vas-y,
vas-y.
Pas vraiment dans la direction de ce qu'Olivier a dit, mais aussi dans cette question du décalage du temps. Si tu peux revenir à la série de 4 photos, oui. Est-ce qu'à ce moment-là, c'est clair qui sera le président, est-ce qu'à ce moment-là, on voit déjà ce qui va se passer en 62?
Donc, ils ne parlaient pas de ça. Celui qui disait qu'il allait être président, c'était Boudiab. Boudiab disait, parce que je prenais toujours une demi-heure avec chacun pour discuter, pour leur donner des nouvelles, etc. Et Boudiab me disait, surtout au CCLP, quand on savait qu'on allait partir, tu sais, moi je vais avoir le poste, comme il disait, il disait pas président, mais il disait le suprême, quoi, on va après. Et c'est comme ça, donc il faudrait que... je peux dire ce qui...
Oh, moi, tu me regardes, moi, je...
Non, parce qu'il y a une chose qui m'avait choquée, enfin blessée, choquée un petit peu, parce qu'il me dit, voilà, il me faut une femme moderne, une femme qui sait recevoir, une femme qui sait truc, etc. Et là, c'est la seule fois où je me suis fâchée avec lui. Je lui ai dit, tu sais, les Algériennes n'ont pas besoin de faire des études. J'ai dit, ta femme est à la Casbah, elle travaille 24 heures sur 24 à une machine à coudre pour élever ses enfants, alors que toi, tu es clandestin et prisonnier, etc. Elle sortira une semaine après, elle sera plus libérée et plus compétente que moi dans les relations, dans les trucs, etc. Alors j'ai dit, ça n'a absolument rien à voir. Il me dit, oui, mais tu comprends, enfin bref. Et il y a une chose, non, mais il y a juste une chose que je voulais dire, c'est que comme les gens pouvaient recevoir des amis, etc., il y avait des amis à lui qui venaient avec une jeune femme pour lui présenter. Alors que ça ne se faisait pas avant. Personne ne rentrait, une femme rentrait comme ça, et alors ça ne lui plaisait pas. Une semaine après...
Alors restons... Il y a un
C'est
dîner,
la seule chose.
il y aura un dîner après si vous voulez rentrer dans des détails bien plus...
Non, mais c'est le seul qui était
important.
sûr, c'est le seul qui était sûr d'être président et qui voulait avoir une femme qui représente l'Algérie. Alors que les autres, non. Aït Ahmed... Vraiment, il était au-dessus de tout ça. Hirak, pareil. Ben Bella, pareil. Bitat, pareil. Il n'y avait pas de discussion, je vais être ou je vais devenir. On ne parlait pas de ça. On parlait de l'avenir, que l'Algérie, ça va être formidable, la liberté, on va se battre. Enfin, c'était tout à fait...
So the first intervention was about Rose Gray, who is an English theorist who speaks of the images of the War of Independence as an archive of aspirations. And so the intervention was just to underline the fact that even though these images do have a very luminous horizon and are full of a certain affect of and aspirations, they also have a tragic quality to them, because of course these are images of a specific moment in time where there is a moment of unity, which won't last very much, as gradually the people appearing on the photos are assassinated, or there's there's sort of dissensus and assassination processes in the years to come. So just to in respect of that memory, to also be aware and name the tragic aspect of them. And then the second intervention was a question about the foresight of the people in these images, of whether there was an idea of who would be president, of the kind of temporal displacement in the political future that these people represented. And the response is that up until that time, except for Bouteflika, who had certain aspirations and also matchmaking pretensions, which led to one of the only quarrels about the abilities of Algerian women, which you can get into at dinner.
Exactly.
There was no sense of personal becoming. The conversations were about the future of Algeria as a collective reality, and except for specific instances, personal becoming was not something that was considered at that time.
I'm very sorry. We're really out of time. So thank you to Mariam for joining us today. Merci beaucoup. So the Bouteflika conversation can continue at dinner.
Thank you for describing this story. I think it's very important, and the response stream is the best.
Non, surtout pour dire que les autres...
Allez,
Attention.
Merci, c'était très bien. Vas-y. Okay, we're going to continue with our next speaker, who is also my dissertation advisor. So I have to really present her in a very, no, I'm joking. This is Ariela Aisha Azoulay, who's professor of modern culture and media and also of comparative literature at Brown. More importantly, also to me, she's an important theorist of photography. She's also an artist. She's a filmmaker. She's a curator, and she combines different she experiments in how, you know, how to create scholarship and to produce scholarship in ways that have been very inspiring to me. She has put a lot of interest in Algeria in the past few years, and she's, to me, bringing something very different, and I'm very excited to have her talk to us and with us today, and to take us maybe towards some places and some people that could have been forgotten or written out or whatever. She is going to say it better than me. So thank you, Ariela.
Where do I find my presentation? Thank you, Adel, for putting together this really incredible, moving event. Et merci, Safia et Myriam, pour partager avec nous votre expérience, votre vision et vos mémoires. Alors, merci beaucoup. Given that we have only 25 minutes, I will just start. Barbara, how do I put it full screen? Okay. So I'm going to speak about celebrating independence, obviously, but also awaiting decolonization. Independence was celebrated on the same date and at the same site upon which 132 years earlier, on July 5th, 1830, the French invaded Alger. Just one note that I forgot to say. There will be captions underneath the images, so I'm going to read what is written on in bigger characters, but you can read the caption because I'm not always going to mention what is in the photographs. And also, Safia, I hope you will excuse me, some of Kwasi images are full, some of them I cropped details. Looking at Kwasi's photograph of the excited and cheerful crowd, we get a clear sense that the movement is gravitating forward toward a place where official announcement will be made. We see people determined not to be left behind or alone. They all walk, singing and dancing, in the malleable choreography of a flock. However, when looking carefully, maybe we can turn a little bit off the light that we will see the images and what I'm pointing to in the images. Thank you. However, when looking carefully, members of the crowd often appear to morph into spectators, seeing a mirrored reflection of their independent selves in the bodies and faces of others around them. Look at them here. This is not a different photograph, but a detail from the previous one. Members of the crowd are neither moving forward nor blocking the movement. Rather, they are attuning themselves to others, learning how others are interpreting and experiencing the meaning of the day. Everywhere it is the same. People are taking time to be with others, inventing their place among them, appreciating how others skillfully stretch the Euclidean space so that they will not be left out. These are not individual acts. Look, count, for example, how many hands and legs work together in order to get one person on top of a truck. They all know where they are heading. They all perform the poetic justice of ending the colonial era at the very site where it began. Allow me to refrain from calling this place by its name right away. Neither will I call it by the new one that the nascent independent state gave to it 4 months after these photos of independence were taken. Bear with me a little longer. I want to share with you the circumstances under which this site emerged as a stage for political self-determination and an object of political desire. It could not come into being without the onto-epistemological violence that the French inaugurated at this very same site, in the heart of the city of Alger. If you have any doubt about the nature of this violence, I will quell your confusion. Destruction and construction form its ontology, taxonomy its epistemology. In a matter of weeks, Alger stopped being the same. It was made unrecognizable to its inhabitants. All the means of violence perpetrated against it were justified by the one goal set by the French in the service of the French, making Algeria French. Frenchmen and Europeans were invited to the city. They were given lands, property, and the carte blanche, allowing them to use their talent and creativity, as well as their entrepreneurial skills, to come up with their vision of French Algeria. They were welcome to use in-house resources to realize their dreams: librarians, architects, painters, engineers, archivists, draftsmen, and soon after photographers, Jean Gézier and Babazoun, scientists, archaeologists, physicians, and soon after psychiatrists, and the list is long. And the indigenous, they had to acclimate to the foreign place that grew out of their soil. This place unhomed them in their homes. Some of the creative minds who came to build a French home in Algeria, made of Algeria, are still celebrated everywhere in France. They arrived with the first military boats, already possessing the tools and instruments they needed to make their important cultural work possible. They were invited to build Algeria, a place where, according to their studies and observations, there were no civil status records, no marriage contracts, no identifiable family names and patronyms, no museums, no libraries, no municipalities, no voting system, no public education, no Grand Boulevard, no post offices, no archaeological digging sites, no tower clocks, no physiognomic science, no taxonomy of people, nor their objects, no punch on precious metal jewels, no history, no repertory of forms that allowed one to police the authorship and ownership of crafts and possessions, no discrete worship buildings that allowed one to determine who belongs where and who was unruly, and no public squares. What they found upon their invasion was illegible Kasbah. Thus, with no further ado, they started their work. Until their departure, 132 years later, with zeal, they turned over almost every stone and built the institutions that I listed above, and more. They planted them in every city across Algeria, so that their absence, rather than their presence, would seem abnormal. Thus, each military barrack, each police station, each municipality, each bank marked another step on the indigenous path to progress that was paved with colonial universal forms, without which modern life could not go on. As the end of the colonial regime was approaching, instead of restituting some of what they took, asking the indigenous for forgiveness, or offering repair, the French sought to take more, from natural resources to works of art, from documents to gas. And yet, the worst part of their onto-epistemological violence did not consist in what they took, but rather in what they left behind. These colonial institutions, which were made of their imperial democratic political concepts and practices, and a series of transgressions and violations which had materialized in space. The seemingly innocent presence of these institutions in post-colonial Algeria was perceived as a political promise, as if once occupied, inhabited, and operated by the liberated colonized, they could cease to function as colonial state apparatuses and serve as the building blocks of an independent Algerian nation. These apparatuses, however, were in fact the political curse of post-independent Algeria. Some understood it earlier, others later, or maybe it was only after a while that they were willing to admit it. This curse is irreducible to individuals' acts. It is rather imbibed in the infrastructure of the colonial state, which in the wake of independence was not dismantled. Algerian liberation was not hijacked post-independence. it is useless to look for a point in time in which the project of independence took a turn, 1965, 1969, or 1975. The failure of the post-independent state is rather innate to a project of independence that subordinated aspirations for decolonization to a desire for a sovereign nation state. In this state, it was not the people who were conceived as the heroes of independence, but a manufactured body politic from which undesired Algerians could be and were actually removed. These institutions are imperial institutions, some of which are commonly cherished, museums, archives, libraries, or public education, were viciously crafted through 132 years of plundered and forced assimilation, 92 years of forced naturalization of one segment of the population, the Jews, 8 years of intense war, almost 2 years of exhausting negotiations. Independence, however, was not achieved through the decolonization of any of these institutions, nor did it create an opportunity to attend to colonial crimes, wounds, injuries, damages, disorders, or syndromes. During the diplomatic negotiations in Evian, the Algerian war or revolution was concluded with a ceasefire and a binding accord between two sides over the transfer of sovereign power from a settler state to a nation state. The negotiations compelled the Algerian side to subscribe unreservedly to the secular principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The relatively long negotiations were like a long rehearsal, wherein the Algerians had to make this French revolutionary language theirs, the same language which had sparked the French Revolutionary Wars. At the morrow of their 1789 revolution, the French were convinced that their conceptions of freedom, rights, and membership in political community were the ultimate best, and they were ready to implement such ideas wherever they could, from Egypt to Algeria. The result was the destruction of other cultures, the replacement of such cultures' century-old political religious formation with those of the French, and the extraction of much of their resources, which were used to finance the newly gained French territories and empire. These events mark the beginning of the destruction of the Jewish-Muslim world. The independence of Algeria was actually its swan song. The Evian negotiations imposed the foundation of a secular democratic state, in which and by which many were not included or protected. French statesmen and soon to become Algerian statesmen had not necessarily agreed upon the composition of the body politic of such a state. Rather, they considered about its malleable nature, which would take form according to sovereign power's interests and would be determined by the sovereign's rights to declare who belongs where and who should be displaced. The Jews and the Archi were among the immediate victims of this transfer of power. Before 1830, there was no question the Jews were part of the Muslim nation and were under its protection, sheltered within the category of the dhimma, which rendered them protected persons according to the Islamic law. With independence, however, Jews were revoked of their place in the Algerian secular state, and Jewish-Muslim life in Algeria, which was as old as Islam itself, was brought to its end. With the absence of Jews from these discussions between Christian French and Muslim Algerians, the two sides of the negotiations in Evian, a shared colonial understanding of the body politic, which excluded Jews, took shape. At the moment of independence, most of Algeria's 140,000 Jews, whose fates were even not discussed amongst these two sides, as they were assumed to be Europeans, that is, embodiments of their colonial reformation, these Jews were already gone. During the months of negotiation, some leaders of the FLN sent the Jews a handful of confusing messages. Jewish community members could not disentangle these messages from the numerous violent attacks they were subject to at the same time. The Jews' absence was normalized like that of other groups subjected to forced migration, provoked flight, and population transfer in other places. Such processes that contribute to formations of the imperial nation state are presumed to be the indispensable price paid for the nation state's birth. And thus, the disappearance of the Jews from Algeria was an event that also disappeared from the history of Algeria until today. Making the Jews disappear was one of the inaugural acts of the onto-epistemological violence exercised by the French. Let's return now to the site of celebration. Look with me toward the foot of this hill. On the left side here, relatively close to the sea, do you see the White Mosque? Unlike the other mosques that were already demolished by that time, and we speak about dozens of them, unlike the other mosques that were already demolished, this one, in a certain way, was saved. But what was saved is only the building itself, while its existence prior to the invasion was never as an isolated building. Here we see it displayed as if it were on a pedestal upon the roofless white cube called the square. But let's not be confused by the language. This square was first posed like a pole over the imperial violence that turned the many buildings which once formed the mosque's entourage into ruins. It allowed the mosque to become this iconic structure. So that mosque that you just saw like a pedestal here, see how it was entangled with other buildings at the Bas Kasbah. Our Jewish ancestors' gaze on this mosque was different than ours. It was not mediated by the wide field of vision opened by the square that invites viewers to look at it from the outside and from a distance. Rather, their gaze was part of their urban epidermis. They did not abide by the dictates of the modern secular fantasy of the public space that invites us to judge the mosque's aesthetic value in order to affirm its religious ones. So here we are in the Place du Gouvernement, whose name was symbolically changed to Place des Martyrs during a military march carried out 4 months after independence. The violence done to the mosque is somehow more evasive and difficult to pin down than that which is typically involved when sites of worship are physically destroyed. In a city in which Muslim and Jews lived and worked together in a close and packed environment, sites of worship had a variety of sensorial, material, cultural, social, and spiritual features and functions. This quality exceeded those that could be characterized by the colonial religious taxonomy imposed by the French, which sought to disentangle Jews and Muslims by denying and destroying the space in which they practiced their shared religious traditions. In order to turn that mosque, Jama el-Jadid, into a white object on a plinth, and to endow it with a fixed meaning, one that communicated the exclusive Muslim provenance of the city, hundreds of other sites of worship, houses, ateliers, and stores to which it was connected through shared walls and paths were demolished. Some piles of rubble and sand were recorded by French artists who came to Algeria to seek inspiration from the local colors and to make a career by depicting these ruins, as well as what replaced them. As a result of the destruction, people lost the material and symbolic rights they once held within the urban tissue. They lost their shared history and their sense of belonging that was once anchored in this now demolished space, which was defined by the overlapping coexistence of Jewish and Muslim craftsmen and their social formations. After the destruction, In 1830, just when they invaded, only from this high angle of the Kasbah from which this photo was taken, an image of the reality of these intermingling lives could still emerge. And this image could emerge only as a perspectival illusion. When we get down the hill, the illusion of the entangled mosque disappears, and we encounter the results of the French invasion. On July 11th, 1830, only 6 days after the invasion of Alger, Jews and Muslims together were evacuated from the city, and the destruction of the heart of Alger, the center in which centuries of knowledge and know-how were elaborated and transmitted across generations, began. The ateliers of hundreds of Jewish jewelers, those of different fabric dyers, those of bracelet makers, bookbinders, illuminators, were all destroyed. The craftsmen, who until the conquest had been members of guilds of peers, had supported and helped each other in difficult times, and had shared their affluent orders in prosperous times, were now thrown into a competitive capitalist market, racial capitalist market, in which they had few chances to succeed. In order to create the square, the Kasbah's lower slopes had to be flattened and leveled. The remains of the houses had to be carved out, and the semi-ditches that this created had to be filled. Once the mosque was broken off, isolated and whitened, the French could display it as an object of their choice and taste. In other words, the same mosque that they were about to destroy, there are some plans in which you see that it was already doomed to be destroyed. So the same mosque that they were about to destroy for its lack of value was reborn as theirs. They transformed it into an object of their choice and admiration, of their connoisseurship and engineering skills, of their careful preservation methods, of their scholarship and art. And thus, they dealt with it as a source of their enrichment. Self-appointed as the guardians of Islamic arts, they could now teach its value and history to the indigenous, who in their eyes neither properly valued it nor knew how to take care of it. Our ancestors' livelihood was literally stolen from them by the French over the course of 132 years. They became the props, the tokens, and the laborers of lucrative French businesses, of French scholarship, literature, museums, connoisseurship, and art. When this clock struck on Dar es Sultan el-Kedima, said Abdelkader, the infidels will be the masters of the country. He anticipated the disastrous campaign of conversion and refused to surrender to the French. Not so long after, the clock was embedded into that building. And when this building was destroyed, it was affixed on the minaret of Jama el-Jadid. Our ancestors worked in small winding alleys and upon the main street, which were named after guilds of craftsmen, the Jeweller's Street or the Dyer's Street. These guilds' formation of self-rule could still serve as our own political models for decolonization. However, this amputation of the urban landscape destroyed the communal existence and self-understanding of my ancestors as Muslim Jews, which was immersed in a shared culture for centuries. The demolition of this whole neighborhood cut off our ancestors' access to their material and spiritual resources. It thus inaugurated one of the major projects of the colonial state, the transference of wealth from one ethnic group to the other. In the process, the French removed the Jews from what they reshaped as solely Muslim culture in a European city. Algerian wealth, excluding lands which the Jews didn't have, was therefore not transferred from Muslims to the French, but from the indigenous, that is, both Muslims and Jews, to the French. Look at this square and see how this pristine binary was invented. from the incredibly rich environment that was buried, that is still buried under this square, only a single isolated building was left, a mosque. This mosque was made an emblem of Islam, and its preservation in the square sought to signify the Muslim culture of the city, as if the Jews were not part of the world in which mosques were conceived, built, sensed, and signified. The exile of Algerian Jews was already written in this square, but we could still imagine our return through reclaiming what is buried underneath what is held close to women's bodies, the jewels. And just one word about the square. Today there are diggings there, and the diggings go directly to the Roman period, not, of course, of what was there prior to 1830. European tourists, settlers, and artists were attracted to Algeria for its charm and for the way it purportedly juxtaposed two civilizations, that of the French and that of Islam. And I'm quoting from one of the settlers. This contrast bursts in the costumes, languages, usages, and even the mode of constructions of habitats. Hundreds of different postcards of the square were printed in huge quantities and were circulated across the world, solidifying the idea of a Muslim monoculture from which the Jews were dissociated. Much of our Jewish ancestors' labor, love, memories, blood, histories, and hopes were involved in building this Jewish Muslim world. Yet, in the 1830s, the French turned it into rebels and simultaneously reorganized Algeria according to their terms. They thus commenced the material and symbolic exile of the Jews from their heritage in the Jewish Muslim world. Rejecting the names that colonial regimes gave to various structures and sites and reverting back to their pre-colonial ones are common gestures of decolonization. Changing, however, the name of this square from Place du Gouvernement to Place des Martyrs was an important homage to the martyrs of the war. But it also marks a failure on behalf of the newly independent Algerian state to attend to the necessity of decolonizing the infrastructure of the colonial political regime that was not imposed in 1954, but rather in 1830. This regime was poised against Algerian livelihood. It attacked Algerian ways of life, especially their engagement in artisanal life, essential to the way they cared for their shared world. Reversing the onto-epistemological imperial violence that is materialized in this square ought to involve the recovery and repair of Jewish Muslim worldliness that is buried under it. Before the Jews were colonized by the French and later by the Zionists who colonized Palestine, they were defined by their professions and were in fact the jewelers of the Ummah, of the nation, of the Muslim nation. The temporary absence of the Jews from the celebration of independence should not mislead us to believe that they will be absent from the decolonization still to come. The Jews are still there in every pair of earrings, in every bracelet, in every necklace, just as they had been for centuries. In undoing the colonial taxonomization of objects as Muslims, as the French colonizers did, we can notice the presence of the Jews again, see them as part of the body of the colonized, and imagine the renewal of the Jewish Muslim world as one of the necessary paths toward decolonization. Thank you.
I'm going to invite Rim Chen to the podium. Rim is a researcher and a photographer, and her current work focuses on the literary photographic, it's hard word for me, literary and photographic representations, and she also edited a very important issue of the journal Continent Manuscrit, if you're interested in Algerian photography, that is completely dedicated to Algerian photography. So very happy to have Rim with us.
The lighting was pretty good with for the screen, I think. Yeah, but I just need to get back this.
I don't know how to help.
Can I? Yeah, sorry.
Maybe we should ask people.
Let's hear.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think so.
And then I just press here.
Yeah.
Also works.
No, this is fine. I don't have a lot.
Okay. If you need to, though, there's a laser, so you can point to something.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so feel free either one. Okay, thank you. Second.
Thank you very much. I'll jump right in now so that we go on. So this is the issue of Continent Manuscrit that Adel was talking about. I'll just leave it just for a little while during my introduction. It'll give you a sense of how I approach things. Yeah, I'll tell you how I approach kind of this question of images and representation through my dissertation and the book that's going to come out soon. So my research has been around literary and photographic representations of Algiers in the 1990s. I began the thinking about it process with a discussion of the quasi-dominant idea, which suggests that the 1990s are a decade without images. That there is only one photograph that would crystallize the conflict of the war, and that photo you have probably seen before. It would be the Madone de Ben Talha by Hussein Zawrar. So the discussion of this idea, which I considered to be inaccurate and untrue and frankly unacceptable, has led me to want to identify the processes of the production of representations of the city, particularly from photographic and literary images. So what I did, I examined accessible images to try to understand their nature and their role in producing representations. For this, I felt like that the dialogue of literature and photography could allow to better make images of the city visible, of the city of Algiers then, as well as display the challenges of the representation. It was a sort of, what started as an intuition became my method. I articulated this around the permeability of genres which characterized my literary text the literary text that I worked on, from which I extracted photographic writings. So le photographique, the photographic, takes diverse forms, going from memories, as in text by Assia Jabar, to mental images with Mohammed Dib, to silent images with Sadiq Aissat, and to actual photographs existing in the body of the text, as is the case with Mustafa bin Fudil, for example. So a very contemporary writer. In examining the modalities by which these representations of the city of the 1990s are made, I suggest that the crisis, entre guillemets, of images, that the discourse around images hit Algiers all the more as its representations were built for a significant part since the colonial period around photography. And so I consider images from the colonial period and the following period. I examine the Algérois space in what it had to offer as a space for the production and circulation of images at a time when the photographic images acquire an absolutely new role. So it appeared that, on the one hand, photographic and literary images closely accompany the colonial process. On the other hand, they deconstruct the colonial logic by inventing forms of counter-representations. The process of counter-representation begins in the early 20th century, takes off during the Algerian War of Independence, and continues to evolve in the context of post-independence. And we're very lucky to see the beautiful, moving, and important photos at from Mohamed Kouassi at the next door, not far from here, which testify to this in a clear and compelling way in the exhibition nearby, and where we're able to see and reread and relook in some ways and rethink how historical moments, historical figures, whether they be political actors or citizens or refugees, are seen, of course, by the photographer, but also how they participate in this weaving together of visual narratives. And finally, we kind of touched on that this morning a little bit. We've seen that with the popular movement of February 2019, the tradition of counter-representation has acquired new momentum and confirms Algiers as a prominent space for visual representation. But I'll come back to this point later. Did I? No. So Algiers appears as a receptacle for mental images and memories that negotiate the space of the city. Surrounded by incomplete representation, artistic practices, and that's what's interesting to me, bring to light a certain number of images and narratives that contribute to fill in the blanks. So I'll just skip over these two and I'll come back later. Part of the practice of writing and of photography, and so of image creation, consists of reversing the colonial gaze, of filling in the blanks of sorts, and reversing the process of invisibilization. I'm very glad that we had this presentation before, because these processes are very visible in different ways until today. This movement of reversal means a reappropriation of images, of memory in a way, of history. This doesn't mean that artists constantly go back to the colonial period, of course, but those practices that are of interest to me invest the city as well as its memory. And so the city becomes a place where history is made, but also sometimes an exhibition space. So here I chose one example of a sort of clandestine happening in Algiers, where one photographer, part of a very active collective in Algeria, decided to put in Algiers photos of Algiers. And I think they put them during the night, and the day after, they were almost gone. And this idea is expressed quite beautifully in a text that you can find online in the Continent Manuscrit. It's just one word about that. I tried to put in dialogue researchers, photographers, writers, and journalists to try to understand. It was really kind of also in parallel of my dissertation, to try to understand the trajectory of image collectively in Algeria, and to see how, and to understand the importance of photography in different aspects of the country's history. So Sid Ahmed Semian writes a beautiful article where he takes the example of what he calls a street museum, so un musée de rue, and that has been in the city for as long as he can remember, and consists of a man exhibiting and selling all sorts of photographs in the street. And these photos, however, are mostly colonial photographs or official photographs, portraits of politicians and so on. And so he wonders about photography and its role and its possibilities. So I just put a little excerpt here in French, but I think that's okay. I'll just read it quickly. So this is the conclusion of the art, enfin, 2 paragraphs before the conclusion, but maybe I want to read you just one passage where he describes what he sees in the street museum, what it means. So, 2 types de photographies s'affrontaient devant nos yeux, celle de la colonisation et les autres, celle d'après. Des photos institutionnelles, de petites propagandes du parti-État qui avait subtilisé l'objectif de la photographie en le détournant vers lui et ce qu'il croyait être la construction d'une nation. Nous sommes restés en hors-champ, dans le dos de la photographie, invisibles. On manquait à l'appel. C'est comme faire une photo de classe sans les élèves, avec juste les professeurs debout, alignés fièrement, chacun dans la solitude de son savoir, dans l'infinité de sa science, tenant contre sa blouse blanche une ardoise avec l'année scolaire marquée dessus à la craie blanche. I'll let you read the second. Although I'll read it. La photographie nous permettra de nous voir, de mieux nous voir, voir ce que nous avons été, ce que nous sommes et forcément ce que nous serons un jour. Elle permet une meilleure perception de la complexité de l'histoire, de ses nuances, de gris et de blanc. Elle permet de voir l'homme dans toute sa splendeur, dans toute sa laideur aussi. Elle montre à quel point nous sommes si semblables et à quel point nous pouvons être si différents. And with this article, what Sid Ahmed Semian does is really wonder about the missing images in the history of photography. More concretely, perhaps, and this I'll go very quickly, it is Malik Alula and Asya Jabbar who took on this project of reversing the colonial gaze in a very direct manner. Malik Alula is now in the now somewhat famous The Colonial Harem, and Asya Jabbar in La Zarda et les Champs de l'Oubli, so a film that she made. So in The Colonial Harem, Alula brings together postcards and writes about them in an attempt to rupture the colonial narrative that constructed and fabricated visual and literary Orientalism. In this book, he contextualizes these postcards. He tries to, not all of them, but most of them, which circulated without any context or information for decades. So in a way, Alula tries to fill in the blanks of postcard narrative. Asya Jabbar, in her film La Zarda ou les Champs de l'Oubli, which was produced in 1982, and which she made with Alula, does something similar. She puts to the screen images and photographs and film experts and excerpts, not experts, and places across not only Algeria but the whole of North Africa. And she writes a short poem, a long poem, in which she gives text and words to these images. So with this very long introduction, then the rest will go quicker, I just wanted to give you an idea of what's at stake when we talk about images in the Algerian context, in my perspective. So here you have, Sofiane Zougar is an Algerian visual artist, visual multimedia artist. He works, his work and projects are the product of a long and complex research, which often involves work with the archive, both private and public. He uses different mediums such as photography, video, drawing, and begins this particular project, so entitled Memory of Violence, in 2013. And he continues to this day and puts in dialogue the practice of the artist and that of the researcher. In just a few years, Sofiane Zougar has accumulated an extensive archive constituted of photographs, interviews, and drawings, which he continuously goes back to. Through this archive, he contributes to individual and collective narratives and images of the 1990s, which have been absent from the official or dominant channels, in his perspective, of course. For those of you who don't know his work yet, I invite you to look at his website also, where he showcases his work, and so in this article that I wrote about this specific project, I go into the different facets of memory of violence, and you can see that what Sofiane Zougar does is truly fascinating. By bringing together images, by working on them, by investigating them, and by sometimes creating new images himself, he suggests the possibility of new narratives. So in the context of the 1990s, where few narratives are visible, the artist takes on the role of a storyteller by offering a subjective context and taking on the archive and working with it, interpreting it, in order to question the violence of the 90s. And so here you have, we can, maybe in the Q&A, if we have time, I can tell you more about the specific work, but it gives you an example of how he works. Another example of this reappropriation of the image and the city through photography is with the work of Omar Dey, that you can find in his book, Algeria, A Biography of Disappearance. In this book, there's a dialogue between family photographs, so a private archive, and a contemporary practice of photography. The photographer puts together identity photos of disappeared people, of letters written by family members, photos of the interior of houses, other photos that the family seemingly wanting to make visible. Then Omar Dey updates all of this with photographs that he takes himself. This way, he writes new narratives to give new consistence of sorts to the disappeared and to a city marked by these disappearances that happened in the 1990s. And now this is a photograph, so by the first artist, Sofiane Zougar, in 2019. So here we have 4 women on the foreground. One of them is giving us her, so we only see her back. The photographer's lens is behind her. Then 2 women are looking to the photographer, towards the photographer. Both are looking somewhere else. Then we have 1 woman looking straight at us, or at the photographer, at the viewer. She has in her hands a paper. The portrait of the man on the paper is hidden, so we don't see his face. But under, we can read in French, Rendez-nous nos enfants, give us back our children. And in Arabic, since 96, no information, no grave. Here, this interaction between the woman, the photograph she's holding, and the photographer is very important. The woman knows she's being photographed. She also wants to put certain events of the 1990s at the forefront and restores an image of the past. In this project, the disappeared are not only the disappeared of the 1990s, but the disappeared of this new popular movement. And the photographs become an archive for the artist. The potentiality of the discourse, the potential history, to use the expression by Ariela Azoulay, continues on working as we keep on renewing our readings of these images. This is a clear echo, if not an anchoring, in Oumardi's project, more than a decade apart. So where the families of the disappeared took to the streets with portraits, they had never stopped advocating for justice throughout the years, but with these more recent marches, there was a new visible platform of expression which was available. Which brings me, and then it's going to be the last part, to so the events of February 22nd, 22 février, I'm not sure how to translate it in English, February 22nd, 2019. So in a grandiose way, fairly recently, so 3 years ago now, we have witnessed a reappropriation of images, especially during the first months of the demonstrations that took place all over the country, but very visibly in Algiers in 2019. What was of interest to me was that these demonstrations meant both, what these demonstrations meant, both for the role of photography and for the history of photography. At the source of images that circulated in the city during the demonstrations was one that opened up a real pathway for me to study photo in Algeria. It is this one. So of the 6 leaders of the FLN during the War of Independence, in retrospect, and in its visual dimension, purely, the start of the War of Independence, November 1st of 1954, is marked by this one photograph. If we have time later in the Q&A, we could maybe talk about the trajectory, but for today, this image shows first that there is a conscious practice and use of the image that takes source at the beginning of the 20th century, and which suggests a particular tradition of the Algerian photography. During the demonstrations, it was interesting to see how many versions of that photograph were printed on posters, on small pieces of papers, on cardboards, and so on. And you also had portraits of the different historical figures that we see together in the first photograph individually, and sometimes also in the form of a painting. So here's one. For example, so Mohamed Boudiaf, who was assassinated in 92, 6 months after he took office. And so the date of the 22nd of February is already a key moment in Algerian history, of course, but also in its visual dimension, as it opened up a new phase for the way we work on images, new and from the archive. And here, the photographers themselves are led to question their practice in the light of the possibility of new representations. Here I took an example of a photographer, so Sabri Ben Ali Sharif, who documented the march, and this is an excerpt of what he says. So I'll read it quickly. Ma pratique photographique récente a été intimement liée au mouvement de protestation que connaît la rue algérienne depuis 2019. Dès que cet élan populaire a inondé les rues du pays, j'ai immédiatement ressenti comme un besoin vital de documenter et de témoigner. De façon instinctive, j'ai saisi mon appareil, sans recul, sans démarche artistique particulière, dans un mélange de photojournalisme et de militantisme. J'ai voulu voir cette rue, ce peuple, cette cohésion. Et mon appareil m'en a pour une fois rapproché. Il a été comme un aimant, comme un outil qui m'a permis de découvrir un peuple imaginé. Comme si cette pratique photographique m'avait enfin fait ressentir mon appartenance légitime à ce peuple, à cette nation. Cette nation dont on m'avait si souvent parlé, mais que j'avais jamais vraiment rencontrée, ou de si près. J'ai aussi senti qu'il fallait faire vite, très vite saisir l'instant, de peur que celui-ci ne se répète plus, de peur d'avoir à retomber dans un no man's land visuel et de retrouver un espace public où l'interdiction de s'exprimer et de photographier librement redeviendra la norme. So, images, it seems, have multiple lives. And what I've tried to show through this small sample is that in this context, the Algerian context, photography has agency. And this is in part a result of the importance of archive, which is in turn an indicator of the mental images which continue to circulate and make their way in the lives of people and in the spaces they inhabit. Whether we're talking about visual culture or visual memory, it seems images are not only not disappearing from our minds, our bodies, our cities, our memories, but they are reactivated, reread, reinterpreted, reused. And so, thinking Algeria at 60 is also that, thinking about the writing of history, thinking about what we want at the center of discussions and of debate, thinking about what images to showcase and to position ourselves by asking ourselves and others, why these images, why these representations, why that power dynamic, and so on. And so, events like these, like today and yesterday, are very important. We are collectively writing a history of Algerian photography, nourished by different perspectives, disciplines, stories, precious testimonies. And for that, I thank you.
I invite Ayla to sit here, and I will help facilitate the questions. Thank you very much, both of you, for these great presentations. Okay, let's start. So, anybody would like to? Jennifer, please.
Thank you.
With the microphone.
Sure. Thank you. I also enjoyed the morning session. I watched everything online. It was great. So I do feel
it worked.
Everything worked.
Okay.
It was beautiful. So I do feel like I have some continuity of conversation. I have a question for each one of the speakers. Ariel, I was interested in the towards the end of your talk, you were talking about the archaeological digs that are going on and how they go straight to the Roman ruins, and this is common across North Africa. And yet, in your meticulous sort of presentation of the destruction of evidence of Jewish life, it is buried in the rubble. So what happens if and when they do encounter objects that don't fit the narrative in these archaeological digs? How are they described? How are they cataloged? How are they characterized? Like, what do they do with that materiality that is in the rubble? And then how are they either written out of the discussion of the progress of that dig, or how are they kind of accounted for in new and different ways? And then for Rim, your last image was very striking to me because it says our history is the ones that we're going to write ourselves. And it made me think about the sort of power of social media and how that's one of the narratives that people are able to rewrite or present their own history. And so how do you think about the role of social media in helping Algerians tell their own history and represent and present themselves in new ways?
I think okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for your question. Let me start, but I wish I could answer your question. I don't know. I know that the digging stopped for a while. I hope to be in Algeria this summer, maybe. With a moment of grace, I will be able to get a visa, so I'll be able to be there and to learn. But what I would like, what I do know, which is important, is that what I do know, not about this, but what is buried there is not Jewish traces, it's Jewish-Muslim traces. This is, for me, the most important. I'm not looking for the presence of Jews wherever they are. I'm interested in the condition of the 20th century that destroyed the possibility or to destroy the condition of having Jewish-Muslim life, and also of having an epistemological or onto-epistemological apparatus to approach this, shared life. So what interests me in this, and you're right to say that it's all over, that, Greek antiquity, Roman antiquity are very appealing, but what they are not interested in digging is what was taken from Muslims and from Jews together, which is each other. But hopefully I'll be there in June and I will know how to answer your question.
Well, Algeria had 60 part 2, right? Like
Voila.
Sure.
With the footballers.
With the footballers.
Social media had a very, very important, played a very, very important role during the movement of the Hirak. As it played an important role in other social movements throughout the world. We saw how what happened in Colombia with the Black Lives Matter, in Palestine. Just for organizational purposes, it was very interesting to see how things worked. For visibility, the first step of that was extremely important also because it showed us, or showed me, a lot of different images that we didn't know existed. And so photographers, professional photographers, made their images available for everyone to see. Doesn't mean we can go and publish them left and right, but they were on public mode, so people could use them to understand what was going on. And that was the force of social media at that time. We saw that it shifted because social media, in my opinion, cannot be a forum for public debate. So I think there's like this, just because it is then a source of repression. And we saw that people can be put in prison because of what they wrote on social media, on Facebook, or so on. And so I think like everything, it's probably a question of equilibrium, but it showed us the possibilities and the limits of that platform. So it is on us to kind of understand how to take all this material that was accessible for a while and how to turn it into something, how to work with it and how to understand it and how to maybe offer new ways of working and of thinking about these different subject matters that were on the public sphere, in the streets, and on social media platforms.
Emma?
Thank you for your communication to both. I'm going to speak in English with my bad accent. Sorry for that. For Ariella, I have a question about. I learned many things in your communication, and I wonder if you didn't talk about the Décret Crémieux, and I wonder if there is something to learn about the citizenship given by assimilation for the Jewish by the French government à la fin des années, the end of the 90s. And I want to hear you about that, about this part of the division, la déchirure du tissu social aussi par la loi, and the assimilation and the fact that the Jewish let their identity and their language sometimes to be French and to choose to be French, and they will be counted by beyond the population of European population at the end of the story. And okay, so it's for you. And for Rima, I'm asking myself about the creation of collective movement by the artists, and I asking myself about the stance that they take, and there is a revendication of do arts with the part of the arts of photography, and in the same time there is some photograph who say, okay, we do politics, we have a political voice, c'est courageux aussi pour les familles disparues, etc. And I asking you if there is something, when there is something collective and when there is some individual parcours. Thank you.
Do you want to start now?
Maybe go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, Jama, for this question. So, till today, when I heard earlier Miriam speaking, and she told me this story, but when I heard it today in public, that when she was 18 or 19, they still went to see the 14 Juillet, right? I feel like a relief. It's not only the Jews, okay? So there is, first of all, something about shame, about what is being called choices, as if the Jews had chosen to be French. They didn't. What intrigues me is how come that this colonial imposition, that in one day, by law, by an authoritative law, they decided that the 40,000 Jews in Algeria will be French citizens in their own countries, while they had nothing of French. How come that this shaped the historiography of Algeria, and especially the historiography of the Jews in Algeria? I just read, yesterday an article by Mandel that, a friend sent me, and it reminded me, in each and every article that I read about the Jews in Algeria, I'm always struck by these contradictions that they don't mind going on with, saying that the Jews chose to be French. But this same guy who writes about this in the 60s, he says, but the Muslim knew that they are not French. The French knew that they are not French. The Jews knew that they are not French. But still, he writes that they chose to be French. As the same goes in 1962, that the Jews chose to leave Algeria. I mean, of course they fled because it was scary. The OAS, the war, everything was scary, and they didn't know where to go. Did they choose to go with the French, who just 1.5 decades earlier sent 75,000 Jews to Auschwitz? No, they didn't choose the French. It was out of no choice that they chose the French. And I think that when it comes to colonization, we must ask this question, problematize this category of choice. This choice is always a choice out of no choice. And for me, what matters is to understand also colonization in its long duration, not only the 132 years of Algerian colonization, but also the 70 years of the colonization of Palestine as in intersections. Because without thinking differently the colonial and imperial geographies, colonial and imperial choices, we cannot decolonize Palestine, right? So there is a necessity, I think, to ask, what does it mean that the French gave them citizenship? This category of the colonizers who are giving, what they give them, they took from them. Because when the French arrived in 1830, the first thing that they do is destroying what became the Place du Gouvernement, which was really the livelihood, centuries of know-how of Jews and Muslims. They destroyed all Jewish institutions because the Jews were only 40,000. They could not destroy all Muslim institutions. So they destroyed less. They destroyed a lot, but less. For the Jews, they destroyed them at the very beginning. 1870, that much of, the historiography is built on, comes much later, after they destroyed so much. And after they left the Jews, I'm thinking about, what I presented today is part of a letter that I wrote to my father. I'm taking my father to a journey. He never took me to a journey in Algeria. So I take him, there is some, poetic justice. So I take him to Alger, and I show him, of course he wanted to be French. everything that was Muslim, that was part of your ancestors' cultures, was no longer yours. It was Muslim. The Jews, they destroyed all the synagogues in Algiers, and they built the big synagogue, you know, in the French cathedral for the Jews, and you had nothing. So of course you wanted to be French. Is it a choice? No, it's not a choice. When each and every individual Jew left Algeria in 1962, did they understand that this will be the end of 2,000 years of Jewish life in the Maghreb? No. So Crimea is important, but Crimea is 1870. In 1865, the French invite Jews and Muslims to apply for citizenship. Both Jews and Muslims couldn't care less. Less than 200 Jews, less than 200 Muslims apply for citizenship. 5 years later, with the defeat of the Prussian-French war, they needed captive population of 40,000, you know, Jews, to call them Europeans, to neutralize their enmity to the French colonization. So they took it as a captive population, and they forced on them citizenship. They didn't give it to them. So yeah, Crimea is important, but it's not the only thing that we have to look at. And what matters for me is really imagining on a global scale the possibility of a Jewish-Muslim world, not only what Christians did to the Jews and brought them to be part of them, which, you know, yield Islamophobia, which yield the perpetuation of the colonization of Palestine, and some other catastrophes along the way. So decolonizing the Jews from Zionist and French colonization means we must account for the colonization of the Jews in order to decolonize Jewish-Muslim history. Sorry for being long.
Thank you, Dana, for your question. I think that when well, it was my way of doing things. I think that when you're talking about photography in Algeria, artistic practices in photography, I'm not talking about photo reporter. You really have to embrace, although a lot of artist photographers are also documentary photographers and reporters, you really have to embrace and really anchor yourself in the idea of the fragment, of fragmented works, of fragmented trajectories, of fragmented journeys. And sometimes you take one book, like the Omar book, and you can choose to analyze only this book and not put it into context with, for example, photographers who could work in Mexico about similar issues, because you don't have a full trajectory of Ahmadiyya's book available. So you can't really understand how he, as a photographer, can address other questions, for example. You have different collective initiatives throughout history, short history. In the 70s, you have different young photographers getting together and trying to organize exhibitions and trying to see what they can do, but there's no institutional relay. And there's life and jobs, and you can't, it never came through. Today, however, in the past 10, 15 years, you've had real concrete initiatives by collectives, people getting together and working together, having different practices themselves, but serving a sort of similar objective of pedagogy, of teaching themselves and others about photography, about methods, about you know, how to copyright a photo, how to send your photographs to this journal, how to organize an exhibition, how to sell your photos, because so they're taking charge of that, and at the same time developing artistic practices, exhibiting around Europe, Africa, and the so I think it's something that's still kind of it's not yet a model because time hasn't made the proof yet, but it's definitely something that is growing, and I think there is more and more an understanding of the importance of collective works to tackle these huge questions that we have to deal with around representation and around the arts and history and memory. So it's so huge. We understand, I think, that we need to work together.
Okay, good. It's between you, you have to decide. You have the microphone right behind you, Sophia.
Okay. So I guess I'll ask Ariella first. I was really struck by your description of this ontological and epistemological violence against the Jews, and I was thinking about this term that you use in your presentation, unhoming, in relation to the term pied noir, which has been applied quite often to Algerian Jews like Derrida, Sixou, Jean Daniel, and I was wondering if you could shed some historical light on how this term has been applied to Algerian Jews in order to kind of remove them, to unhome them from the Maghreb.
Yeah, so thank you. So first of all, the onto-epistemological violence is against everybody, all colonized. I described, some aspects of it that targeted the Jews specifically, but, and I use this term of the onto-epistemological violence because oftentimes I hear people speaking about epistemological violence, and I think that it's misleading because we have to understand how deep is the destruction and construction of, the colonial regime. Without this deep, and I try to show it, in really a very small place, the Place des Martyrs, without understanding how much they reshape the ontology, we cannot understand this, epistemological attack. Because otherwise you would think that, okay, I will change my perception and everything will be fine. But you change your perception and the world is still, ontologically damaged. And the pied noir, I think it's really one of the most shameful academic category that historiography continues to be written about the Jews as if they were pied noir. But, in a way, as we're speaking about onto-epistemological violence, they were left like pied noir. When I look at images of departure, so the keys sometimes are being identified. But when I look at the Europeans, so obviously I recognize the Jews, but I recognize them because unlike the way that they are being told as if they were totally French, they still have, the scarf on their hair. They still, carry many children with them, not only one, of the nuclear French family. So I can recognize them, but they are completely, they completely disappeared. In the same way that in the 2 years of the Evian negotiation of Evian, they are not being discussed. In this kind of, book, very big volume of the protocols of Evian, they are not being discussed. So being called pied noir, and even the Jews themselves call themselves pied noir, because, ontologically, this is how the French treated them, as pied noir. And this is really a kind of shameful that it is being reproduced in academic discourses still today. But I think that we can see in it the way that Frantz Fanon spoke about the interiorization of the colonial categories, the embodiment of the colonial categories. But with Fanon also I have a problem because Fanon himself related to the Jews as if they were Europeans, even though he knew that the Jews were not Europeans, they were Jews. They were Jews, and he used them as informants, which means that he knew that they can help him to understand the Muslim society, because in his clinic in Blida, there were Europeans and Muslims, and the Jews with whom he worked, Cherki and Azoulay, were his informants to the Muslim society. So calling them pied noir at the end is, I don't know. Thank you. And unhoming, yes, obviously. But I think that, the colonial project is unhoming everybody. When you look at Palestine, what the Zionists did is to unhome Palestinians in a way that in 1948, the minority of Palestinians that were left in Palestine, the 150,000 Palestinians, none of them stayed in the same locality. They were all internally transferred from one place to the other in a way that none of them will be indigenous to their lands. So this is really part of the colonial project, and it matters to me to understand this in connection to the Jews under the French colonization.
We'll take the final question from Madeleine, because then we have to move on. Can you give her the microphone? It's gone.
Thank you for both presentations that were really powerful and fascinating. I have a question for Reem. I'm interested in this thesis of absence of images of the 1990s, and I'd really like to hear more about the work you're doing to turn that I don't know, an archive into an archive. But I'm also wondering about, since you're working with literature and I guess film as well, how you see those relationships in terms of representation, because, I mean, certainly there are literary representations, there are films about the 1990s, and something that is often said about them, although I think this is changing, is that they tend to converge on a kind of single narrative rather than, a pluralizing narrative about the kinds of violence that were happening. But I'd be curious to hear you talk about the relationships among these different media.
I didn't work on film. I worked with novels and photography. And so this idea of the 1990s being without images is something that we hear about different war zones, right, in the world. It just means that, okay, images are very hard to access, and what do they mean, and why can't we access them as the West, for example? And it's something, I think, in regards to Algeria, that echoes also this war that doesn't say its name when we talk about the Algerian War of Independence. So we are talking about, what was bothersome to me is that this idea of a war without images, a country without images, is that it is one dominant discourse, so a Western discourse, that is basically taken as a truth. So being from that place, I saw it was untrue. But to understand that, but it is what is true is that, and Jama, you were talking about this morning, right? About all these images that we did see in different places, or that we knew were taken, and are kind of exhumed or unearthed now, right? After 10 years of war, after all those victims, after all the aftermath, and in literature. So I think I didn't. There are a lot of novels treating of the 1990s. And I chose just a few. I was very, very selective in my approach, because what I wanted to see is what writers wrote in a photographic way. And you have texts by Essa Jabbar, so you have the famous one, Le Blanc de l'Algérie, but you have poems that you can find where she talks about the Ben Talha massacre, where she talks in a text about a photograph without naming that photograph. And so for me, it was all these little things that I looked for to give me an indicator, an understanding of how I can approach photography. So by asking a lot of questions, basically. Why would Essa Jabbar talk this way about a photograph, about a massacre at Harvard University a year after? And anchoring herself also in a visual tradition where she understands that the echoes between the War of Independence and the War of the 1990s it's not the same war. It's not, the parallels that are often made can be understandable, but usually that's not good enough. You can't just put parallel, you can't just put these wars into parallel. I mean, just as, a war of independence, a revolution of independence that takes you out of 130 and some years of colonization into independence, that is a success. Then what happens after it, the revolution, what we started calling the revolution of 2019, I think it was for the rhetoric of it, and maybe some of us believed that it was going to be a revolution, or maybe it is still going to be, who knows. But all these things, all these echoes, all this material that is accessible, I try to kind of understand the echoes and kind of create an ecosystem of images, of texts, to not make sense of history, but understand a couple of things. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. Thank you very much. So we're going to have the final two. Dismissed. We're going to have the final two presentations of the day, and I would like to call Sophia Mo, please. Sophia is a candidate in the French department at Columbia University, and her work focuses, her dissertation is called Sisterhood in Translation, Gender, Nationalism, and Cross-Colonial Solidarity in Algeria. So I invite Sophia to join us and to start her presentation.
I know we didn't have time to take a break, so I'll do my best to speed things up a bit. Right, so, thanks everyone for being here, so late on a Friday afternoon. I'm very touched. All right, let's see if this works.
Do you want us to turn on the light a little bit?
I think it's good. It's good. Yeah, I'm just going to jump right into it. So in the aftermath of Algerian independence in 1962, we see three women sit in a living room for a press conference. Newly released from prison, they sit in a newly independent Algeria. Who are these women? From left to right, we have Zora Drif, Baya Hossein, and Jamila Bouhaired. All were part of the FLN's bombing network during the so-called Battle of Algiers. Zora Drif is best known for her role in bombing the Milk Bar. Baya Hossein bombed Adbiar and Badkour, and Jamila Bouhaired, who is probably the most famous of all of them, made international headlines during her high-profile court case. And all three women were incarcerated and sentenced to death, and all of them lived to see independence. So the photographer, of course, is Mohamed Kouassi, the man in the middle. Kouassi worked for the Algerian Ministry of Information, as we've heard from earlier today. His photos were published in the official mouthpiece and newspaper of the FLN, and Mujahid. He worked alongside writers like France Fanon and Assia Djebar, pictured here, to craft a narrative that would help rally international support for the cause of Algerian independence. So this slide offers a brief glimpse of the kind of articles and photos about the women of the revolution that the newspaper Al-Mujahid published in French and Arabic. Al-Mujahid's fight took place on the wartime front of public opinion. The photos that it published were meant to create and reinforce a certain official narrative about Algerian independence. That is, the revolution has only one hero, the people. Un seul héros, le peuple. United in their struggle against colonialism. These women are just a few among countless examples of those who did not hesitate to liberate Algeria. Now, to advance such a narrative, the women of the FLN had to get into character, so to speak. Look at this photo, for example. Based on their manner of dress and facial expressions, this could be mistaken for a film still taken from the Battle of Algiers, Gio Pontecorvo's 1966 cinematic representation of the Algerian Revolution. It could be a film still of three actors of varying experience. And when I say actor, I mean that both in the sense of historical actor, so someone who makes an impact on history, as well as in the sense of someone who performs. Any image that we look at tells a kind of story. It stages a kind of performance. That is, viewers never have unmediated access to an objective truth, if there is such a thing. There's always an interpretation of the facts. And in the case of the FLN's drive to influence public opinion via newspapers like Al-Mujahid, the front of public opinion is a theater of sorts. That means it entails performing in front of an audience. Indeed, the women of the FLN were key characters acting in the theater of public opinion. So this slide here shows some of the most circulated images of the Mujahidat, the female freedom fighters. At the top left, we see Pablo Picasso's drawing of Jamila Boupasha, who is also part of the Algiers bombing network. Feminists Simone de Beauvoir and Gisèle Halimi wrote about Boupasha's rape and torture case, and in doing so, mobilized public outrage against French colonial rule in Algeria. And here in the top middle, in sepia tones, is the actress Magda Asabahi in the role of Jamila Bouhaired in Youssef Chaheen's 1958 film, Jamila the Algerian Woman. This film, which was greatly successful in the Arabic-speaking world, sparked protests demanding justice for Bouhaired in front of the French embassy in Cairo. And then to the top right corner here, we see images from these protests. In the bottom left is a very curious photo of 4 female freedom fighters in the Algiers bombing network. So from left to right, we have Samia Lakhdari, Zora Drif, Jamila Bouhaired, and Hasiba bin Bouadi. So these 4 women are posing with guns here. And then finally, in the bottom right, we have a film still from the Battle of Algiers, in which one of the FLN bombers infiltrates the European quarter, smiling flirtatiously as she passes border control. So in this slide, I've purposefully mixed fictional images with real ones to make the point that it's actually quite difficult to tell one from the other. Sometimes what we see in the movies looks real, and sometimes reality looks like the movies. The figures that we see in these photos, like the figures that we see in movies, are characters in a story. In the legendary story of Algerian independence, these women are historical actors. Posing for a picture means getting into character. The boundary between fiction and reality is blurred. So what kind of story can be read in these images? I read one of unwavering defiance, of determination. The only ambivalence, the only reservation I see is in Jamila Bouhaired's face in the gun photo in the bottom left corner. So we'll come back to this photo soon. Now let's go back to the first image. Compared to the better-known images that we just saw on the previous slide, something's pretty different about this one. Chronologically, it comes a bit later in 1962, after independence. So what kind of story can be read in this image? One of celebration? Well, it depends on where we're looking. Let's start with the woman on the left. 27-year-old Zora Drif laughs openly and tilts her head, looking at Jamila Bouhaired, or perhaps someone off frame. Perfectly coiffed and dressed in the fashion of young Algerian women in the 60s, she wears a crisp sleeveless shirt and a high-waisted skirt. Her hands rest elegantly, semi-clasped in her lap. Drif is poised and picture-perfect. You'd hardly suspect that she was just released from prison. Now, if you were to crop her out, so this is a detail from the previous photo, to look at just Drif and not the other 2, you could easily title the picture Algerian Woman Celebrating Algerian Independence. And it fits well with other photos that have been taken of her and circulated. There's a coherent story, a kind of roman photo, that can be told from these few pictures that I have up here. Here in the sepia image on the bottom, Drif grins and poses with a gun. In the 1957 photo of her arrest in the middle, which is the picture that made it onto the cover of her memoir, she looks defiantly at French soldiers. 5 years later, here on the left, she's free and she's laughing. Drif is extremely expressive. She's very dramatic. Her body language and facial expressions in these photos, combined with the fact that she has willingly made public her account of the revolution in the form of a memoir, suggests that she's aware of how these photos will be used to tell the triumphant story of the revolution. Now let's have a look at the other 2 women in the photo, who are clearly less comfortable with being in the limelight. 22-year-old Baya Hussein sits in the middle, gazing at a point outside the frame. Keeping with the times, she wears a knee-length sheath dress, her hair is straightened and bobbed, a delicate face framed by big hair. Her lips curve slightly upward in a mysterious half-smile. Relaxed or tense? Tense in trying to look relaxed. Her shoulder muscles are tightened and her arms are folded across her waist. In Baya Hussein, I see a character posing for a painting, trying to settle into a position that reads as calm, collected, composed. 27-year-old Jamila Bouhaired sits to the right. She looks at and listens to Drif. She too wears a crisp blouse and a knee-length skirt. Wary, she does not smile. Her shoulders are slightly shrugged. What attracts my attention immediately are Hussein and Bouhaired's crossed arms. Hussein's arms are folded but seem more relaxed than Bouhaired's. As for Bouhaired's body language, her shoulders are raised and her left hand holds onto her ribcage as if assuming a defensive position, as if shielding herself. In Bouhaired, I see a character who's attentive, listening, yet uncomfortable, unsure, out of place. This part of the picture doesn't tell the same kind of story as the other part told by Drif. And it bears emphasizing that each of the three women has had a different way of dealing with being in the public eye and recounting their lived experiences of the revolution. Drif published a memoir and is open to being interviewed. Hussein's prison writings were only published posthumously. And Bouhéred, to this day, refuses to give interviews and refuses to write a memoir. So these varying levels of comfort in the public sphere, I think, are reflected in these women's facial expressions and their body language. In this photo, I see parts that don't quite fit together, parts that tell a conflicting story. These are details that tell me that the characters aren't totally in character. They forget to pose, or they're half posing, or they're caught off guard. So what do we scholars do with images like this? Or maybe the better question is, what do these images do to us? How do they unsettle us? How do they shake up stale ways of thinking about how history is made? I insist on this, on the power that photos have over us in order to resist the common temptation to attempt to fit historical evidence into a narrative that we think we already know. Yes, photos are pieces of evidence that can be manipulated to tell a certain story, like in the case of FLN's creation of a nationalist narrative via newspapers like Al-Mujahid. But what happens when we really pay attention to what these photos are expressing? I call this way of studying historical and archival documents the ethics of looking and listening. This means taking care not to discard, dismiss, or pigeonhole forms of expression that are not immediately legible in terms of predetermined categories. Mohamed Kouassi's photos of these three women fall within this gray space. They don't necessarily contradict the narrative that the FLN wanted to advance, but they show ambivalence. If you look closely, they reveal that victory is something that has to be staged. When actors are called to perform on stage, but a few of them keep slipping out of character, it reminds the audience that it's a rehearsal, it's a work in progress, and that the actors sometimes get tired of being in character. So my approach to the ethics of looking at and listening to archival documents is to juxtapose images and film footage that have enjoyed wide circulation with those that have received less attention. Compare, for example, the post-independence photo of the women sitting in the living room to the more famous pre-independence one where they're holding guns. And so this is a detail of the gun photo from before. This photo is clearly posed. And the contrast between Drif and Bouhéred in that photo is comical. Drif is clearly having a blast with her rifle, whereas Bouhéred manages just a strained smile, a handgun in both hands. It's a performance of a victory to come, but it reads as an imperfect rehearsal if you look closely. There's a certain continuity in personality between the two photos. Seeing the two photos side by side helps the viewer understand the differences between these two women. Even after independence, Drif is more expressive, whereas Bouhéred is more restrained. There's a reason why some of these photos, including this post-independence one here on the left, don't end up making it into the media. So the next slide, in contrast, shows a photo that did make it into history. It made it into Drif's memoirs, and you can easily find it in a web images search. The three women's posture changes slightly for their group shot. Getting into character, they pose for the picture to be taken. Bouhéred and Drif smile widely, showing their teeth. Hussein manages a neutral half smile. She sits very close to Bouhéred. Her half-clenched fists cross over each other. Bouhéred's arms are still crossed, but a little more relaxed than in the previous picture. Her ambivalence is much less visible in this picture. Drif leans forward with one palm crossed over the other. Even just her hands, which betray no nervousness or anxiety, say, "I'm ready to have my photo taken." For the FLN, this photo is distributable because there are no visible signs of fracture. The parts of the photo fit together better than in the previous one. Now let's look at a few photos from after the press conference. We cut to a photo that looks much more celebratory than the previous one. Everyone's showing their teeth, and the journalists have left. The man in the middle, Ali Ouzgan, puts his arms around the three women and looks straight at the camera with a huge smile. Baya Hussein, on the right here, also looks straight at the camera with a big smile. Her hands come uncrossed. One grasps Uzgan's hand and the other is curled into a loose fist, as if she were about to raise it and say, "We did it." So breaking out of her reserved body language in the previous photos, she looks as if she's about to jump out of the frame. When I look at Baya Hussein here, I see motion. So, sorry, too quick. Zora Drif, in the middle here, she comes up behind Uzgan and Bouhered, putting her hands on their shoulders. The camera catches her in a blink and an elated smile. A part of her face is obscured by Bouhered's hair. Whereas Drif and Hussein look unrestrained in their expression of joy, Bouhered holds back. She smiles but looks down, averting her gaze. Her arms are no longer crossed, but she keeps one hand over her elbow in a semi-defensive position. She looks bashful, as if she isn't quite ready for yet another picture of her to be taken. A version of this photo is published in Drif's memoirs. This one feels somehow less candid and more posed. In this one, Bouhered and Hussein are ready for their picture to be taken. You can tell because they're looking straight at the camera and offer the viewer measured smiles. Compared to the others, Drif and Uzgan look less restrained in their expression of joy. This photo conforms to a more straightforward narrative about Algerian victory. For the last image that I'm going to show from this particular series of photos, let's rewind back to the actual press conference when the journalists are still there. Among the photos in the series, this is probably the closest that we'll get to a candid. And by that, I mean that Kouassi's camera catches its subjects before they get into proper poses. Here, like in the other photos, Bouhered shows herself to be quite reserved. Her face is turned away from the camera, her arms are still crossed in a defensive position, and her shoulders are still shrugged. At least some of the subjects of the photo know and acknowledge that they're being photographed, but look as though they haven't had time to settle into a pose. Drif and Hussein, along with two men at the margins of the photo, look directly at the camera. Drif looks stern. Hussein looks almost bored. Bouquets of flowers, ashtrays, and snacks sit on the coffee table in front of them. Gifts for the actors, so to speak. This is a grand occasion, but in this particular shot, the women are caught out of character. As I mentioned earlier, it's hard not to compare these photos to the scene with the three bombers in Pontecorvo's film, The Battle of Algiers. At the end of the sequence where they do their hair and makeup, the percussion comes to an abrupt halt as the camera cuts to an almost still image, an almost freeze frame. The three women pose as if they were having their picture taken. Hasiba, this woman in the middle, leans against a sofa, a jacket draped over her shoulders. To her right is an older woman, also leaning casually with her hip chucked to the side. Both women pose calmly with one hand clasped over the other across their waist. On their left sits a young woman, looking down and glancing at her two comrades worriedly. The other two continue to stand perfectly still. The contrast between these women tells two stories, one of unwavering determination and another story of hesitation, of uncertainty, of ambivalence. So in comparing these photos with each other, I ask, when does reality imitate the movies? And when do the movies imitate reality? Now, this is a question that Lebanese filmmaker Marwa Arsanios thinks through in her 2012 short film, Have You Ever Killed a Bear? Or Becoming Jamila. This slide shows a still within a still, a movie within a movie. The film, which is narrated entirely in standard Arabic in the first person, tells the story of an unnamed actress who, having fallen in love with Jamila Bouhered's image in popular media, accepts to play the part of the beloved revolutionary icon in an upcoming film. In various scenes, we see the actress recreate scenes from Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers and Shahin's Jamila the Algerian Woman. These remixed modern-day scenes, if you will, are interspersed with audio clips from the actual, with actual clips from the film, The Battle of Algiers, with the audio cut and the actress giving a voiceover. So Arsanios is playing with widely circulated images and film clips and draws attention to the blurred line between fiction and reality, evidenced by the split subjectivity of the actress who narrates. Sometimes she speaks with her own voice as actress, and sometimes she speaks as a distant spectator who watches herself act. And sometimes she speaks as Bouhated, who is tired of being asked questions. So in this film still, the actress holds up a picture of the female bomber from the Battle of Algiers and says, "You better place the bomb according to the plan." These words are taken from the script of a movie where I will play the part of Jamila Bouhated. Arsanios's work is powerful in its ability to push us to reflect on what images do to us and what we can do with them to tell new stories that diverge from dominant historical narratives. It also gets us to think about the ambivalent status of historical figures as both actors and spectators. Dissociation results from the uncanny feeling that an actor gets when she watches herself act or sees how she has been represented by others. She asks, "Is that really me?" I will now play a short excerpt from the film that showcases this splitting of subjectivity. The narrator/actor describes her role as an extra and enters into a state of dissociation. The scene might be confusing at first. Let me see if I can pull this up here, because I don't think it's embedded within this. So the scene might be confusing at first because the actress describes herself as an extra, but in fact she's playing the main role of the cafe bomber. So here we go.
كان يجري أحيانا تصويري من الخلف أو وأنا جالسة أمام طاولة، وهنا تروني أتحدث مع رجل. أحسست أني مثل عنصر من جمهور بلا طائل جالس داخل إطار. كانت لمنصة التصوير أكثر من جمهور: التقنيون، المزينون، المساعدون، كاتبة السيناريو وإلى آخره، إلا أني كنت داخل الإطار. أتفرج على مشهد مع بطلة من الفيلم وهي تدخل القهوة لزرع قنبلة. جلست أتفرج بشكل سلبي على زرع القنبلة. اكتفيت بأن أجلس ظهري إلى الكاميرا أتفرج. عرفت أنها ستذهب للقيام بذلك. تركت الغرفة دون أن أحاول إيقافها. لم أكن مبالية. لم أكن مكترثة. أنقذت نفسي وتركت الملهى. بعد التفجير عم السكون، ثم صيحات من الهلع والعويل. لم أكترث ببقية إكسترز الفيلم. أجسادهم، أو لنسميها أجساد الإكستراز، تناثرت على الأرض. المطعم كان عابقاً بالدخان، والأرض مدرجة بالدم المراق. دم قاتم، أحمر، داكن. تبعت الممثلة إياها وهي تسير في الطريق. كنا على مسافة دقيقة واحدة من الملهى عندما سمعنا دويل الانفجار. لم أكن أعرف لماذا أتبعها. لم أكن أعرف إذا كنت في صفها أو ضدها، وإذا ما كنت أتبعها كي أشي بها إلى الشرطة أو أسير خلفها كي أنضم إليها في النضال. كنت أهم لتوي بالانصراف من حول البار عندما رأيتها تزرع القنبلة وتركت الإكستراز يموتون. هنا أنا ناجية من تفجير البار. مرة جديدة رأيت نفسي تراقبها من بعد. أريد أن أنساب تحت جلدها وأن أصير أنا هي وأسرق قصتها.
So the narrator describes herself as an extra to signal that she's an actor/spectator at the margins. Whilst watching the set, she's caught in the narrative frame. An extra is an untrained actor with a disposable body, someone who can easily be replaced, just as these female freedom fighters, even the ones who became famous, become nearly interchangeable, substitutable for one another. I want to apply this notion of being caught inside the narrative frame to that last photo of the press conference. So Bouhated in the middle peers over curiously at what the reporter is writing on his notepad, as if she wants to check what's being written about her and the other two women. While Bouhated observes their stories being written into history, Hossein and Rif uneasily watch themselves being watched by the machine that will project their image to the rest of the world. Their facial expressions and body language call attention to the fact that they've been interpolated to play the part of characters in the story of the revolution. In this particular photo, The three stars of the show look out of place, as if they've been caught by accident in a freeze frame, especially Bouhéded as spectator of history. This photo is from 1962, but it's also a photo where the temporalities of the past, present, and future are entangled. The past is in what the reporter has written down in his notepad. The present is in the frozen, interpolated gazes of Hossein and Drif. And the future is in Bouhéded's gaze turned towards the journalist's notepad. How will you remember us? How will we be written into history as heroines of the revolution? In these future-oriented questions, I see Bouhéded bearing witness to the process that turns her and the other women into historical subjects. This act of witnessing creates a doubled self, a self that is part of history and a self that is alienated from that history-writing process. I see Bouhéded as an actor whose subjectivity splits as she watches herself be represented on the page of a journalist's notebook. Maybe what that journalist is writing is a version of the story that will make it into the Algerian and international press. Seeing these photos lets us see different angles of this history. Official history, with a capital H, fractures into smaller, subjective histories, lowercase h. We viewers look at the women, but there isn't only one unidirectional gaze from viewer to photograph subject. Look at where they're looking. Their gazes too create a narrative, one that we cannot access directly, but that we can piece together by the process of interpretation. I conclude on an open-ended note by inviting the audience to look again at where the women in this photo are looking, while simultaneously listening to what Franco-Algerian writer Hélène Sixou wrote in a letter to Zora Drif in 1998. Alors je lus le journal, Zora Drif armée dans la Kasbah, aux côtés de Yassif Saadi. C'était le message, le résumé des livres écrits par-dessus nous. Nous sommes des personnages dans un grand récit. Nous roulons à la ligne sur la page sans jamais voir le volume où nous figurons. Bouhéded looks at the lines on the page. Perhaps she wonders how those lines will morph as they make their way to the theater of public opinion. How those lines will be a part of a greater, glorious narrative about the part that women played in the revolution, a role that has attracted increasing attention over recent years, but never enough. Baye Hossein and Zora Drif look straight at Mohamed Kouassi's camera, the machine that will turn their images into pieces of history. The end.
Thank you, Sophia. So I call our last presenter of the day, Mohamed Amr Mezien. Mohamed is a philosopher and a performer. He's the author of Des Empires sous la Terre, his first book, published in French by La Découverte in 2021. And very importantly to the Brown community, Mohamed will be joining us starting next fall as an assistant professor in the Department of French. Mohamed, please come in.
All right. Hello.
Let's get you out of here.
Oh, out of here. Because I can get out. It's okay.
Okay. Which is yours? Okay, so
It's this one.
this is you,
Yes.
but that's in a PowerPoint. And when you want to
Okay.
do the music, you just
Yes.
click
Okay. Yeah. Got it.
So do you want to start it or later?
No. I'll start it later.
Okay.
It's just to have is it possible to have
Yeah.
full screen?
You have to go full screen.
This one or this one? This
You could do
one?
no, this screen here. Yeah.
This?
Yeah.
No.
That's a full screen, yeah.
Okay.
And then
So
you,
this is
and then you
the-
click on that for the sound, for the clip.
Okay. Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope everything is okay because I'm the last presenter, so you're probably exhausted and so we're going to try and make this short and to the point. So first of all, thank you, Adel, for this invitation. I mean, I would like to thank also Barbara and the team members of the Center for Middle East Studies and Francophone Studies and all the sponsors and everyone for this amazing invitation. I mean, inviting event and a great invitation. But I must say it's quite a challenging invitation as well, at least for me. to the extent that, at least in my view, you're asking us to think about Algeria differently, through the eyes of someone, through the eyes of an artist, through the sensibility of an actor, and through or via its visual traces. It means, in my view, somehow that Algeria, from this point of view, cannot be considered only as an object of study. It means somehow that this very notion of an object that one could study by using the methods of the humanities and the language of academia is immediately complexified and questioned. You're asking us to talk and think, in other words, about Algeria as a legacy, as a aesthetical and political heritage. This legacy indeed has been both political and sensible, as we can see from all the photographs and pictures we've been seeing and examining, changing the way we act, think of ourselves, and feel. This is why I want to try and think about Algeria as a point of view or a point of vision, as a perspective on the world rather than an object in the world, a perspective which does not refer to any ethnic or national belonging, but rather to a certain position in the world, to the act of being faithful to a worldly movement. As a point of view, or rather a point of view is, as I said, I think, a point of vision, a place from which one can see a given totality, fragmentary totality, which in this case is this event called the Algerian War of Liberation or the Algerian Revolution, or as I will propose later on, the Algerian Uprising. The meaning of which will always remain unstable, open-ended, simply because nobody can see an event as a totality, because we humans only see fragments of events, and each of them make us see and hear something about this living totality that here we call the Algerian Revolution. Through these photographs of a broader event, you're putting the perspective on the event at the very center of the event itself, making it sensible again. By choosing Mohamed Kouassi's photographs, you point towards how the Algerian uprising is seen through a particular sensibility in particular places, with an infinity of questions surrounding them, to the extent that these pictures are fragments of life, from the most grandiose and legendary portraits to the most ordinary dimension of life. To some extent, we could say that this uprising continues, if only because the archives we found about the event reconfigure our sense of the event itself, simply because, ontologically speaking, the event is nothing else but the totality of how it was lived, the series of the perspectives on the event itself. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to do something I never really did. So I'm a philosopher by training, I'm also a musician, but I became, without noticing it, a historian. But the thing is, I've been a historian, I'm not going to go into the process, that would be a bit, too long. But I started sort of, being a historian of philosophy, 19th century philosophy, Hegel, and so on. And then by studying the archives and the sources, as we say, that these philosophers read, somehow a connection with the colonization of Algeria sort of, became sort of evident in ways that I will not talk about. But what I want to say, my point is that I've been able to write historically about colonialism, colonization, but I've been absolutely unable, for a reason I would like to explore, to think historically about the Algerian Revolution. In my view, at least, this comes from the fact that history and maybe social sciences as we know them are limited to the extent that there always are more or less modes of objectifying what they talk about. So what I want to try and do is to begin to think about Algeria as a point of view and from the point of view of the Algerian uprising. While I was presenting some of the historical works I've been, doing about colonial Algeria, one of the objections that were made was precisely that I was only talking about the colonial archives, about the colonizers, and never about the Algerians themselves. I would like to respond to this objection by saying something very brief and simple, is that the reason why Algerians are not speaking in a history which is organized around colonial archives is that precisely they cannot have a voice in a system organized around what I would like to call radical deafness. And what I wanted to write about historically was precisely about this deafness, which I consider as part of the essence of what one could call imperial coloniality. Historians, of course, I know this, have been insisting on the agency of the colonized with great detail and great interest. But history, I want to suggest, is also part of the problem, if only because to archive the margin, is already premised upon a notion of historicity which relate to and refers to a Western modern concern. It doesn't mean to say that there is no history of the Algerian people or no history of the Algerian uprising. It means that when one looks into this uprising or these revolutionary movements, one refers to an alternative notion of historicity that one cannot reduce to a broad, predetermined concept of history. The only archivable voices which nevertheless appeared to me during these historical inquiries was the voice of Amir Abdelkader, himself, in fact, just a trace of a much broader movement, probably unarchivable. And what I understood precisely is that I couldn't understand. I understood that the language he was speaking could not be understood as a historical fact, because it was referring to a form of discourse that we lost, metaphysical poetry, somewhere between arts, politics, spirituality, at their frontier or at their barzakh. So I quote from him. He's writing a letter to Bugeaud, the general who was in charge of different massacres. Have you seen the wave rising up when the bird touches it with its wing? This is an image of your passage in Africa. Before trying not to give any comment about this quote, but to think along the quote and with the quote, maybe as you can see, I'm using philosophy as a way of filling gaps, if this is even possible. I just want to say that here there is a limitation of any kind of archival work, because it is the entire system of concepts we use to write history that must be questioned to make sense of such a sentence. Starting from what being both a Sufi metaphysician and an anti-colonial fighter means, and why the world we live in makes this impossible to hear, on both sides, in fact, of the so-called divide between the West and the Muslim world, the secularists and the Islamists. As you've heard, Abdelkader talks about a wave which rises up, right? And I want to go back to a word that we're using, which is an Arabic word, and this word is thawra. So, for different reasons, we use revolution in order to translate this concept, right? Thawra. But in fact, the root of this word partly refers to the action of standing up, of being physically able to say no to a particular regime, and to some extent one could say to say yes to oneself, or to what, Madeleine, you were calling repossessing oneself. This is why, and this is one of the questions I want to ask by sort of pointing to this etymology and to a form of untranslatability, is thawra revolution? Is it completely translatable within the revolutionary framework. The uprising, in my view, was not a way of speaking the language of the colonial state, which would have meant claiming imperial citizenship, equal rights and liberty for Muslims within the structure of the empire. This coexistence precisely was what was made impossible by the very structure of the colonial state, I would tend to say by its internal contradictions, that is to say by the presence of settler and the agrarian capitalist economy based on the expropriation of the so-called native. From the impossibility of full imperial integration, what emerged was the necessity of a rupture with the language of equal liberty, which can be called a democratic language of justice, of freedom, dignity. All these words depend upon the possibility and the reality of one action, unification by all means possible. By saying this, referring to this trinity, right, between justice, liberation, and dignity, and the ways in which this trinity depends from this sort of fourth term, which also is the first, unification, I'm trying to just give a conceptual interpretation of the Summum Congress, which deploys these different concepts in ways that are, in fact, in my view, not reducible to what, for example, to the language of the French Revolution, as Ariela was also, showing us the sort of discrepancies between the French revolutionary language and the Algerian revolutionary language. So I want to suggest that this language of unity is what nurtures the entire text written during the Summum Congress, which is often called the first constitution of the Algerian state. For a reason I will explain later on, I want to say the first constitution of the Algerian commune. If one is not seized by this vital emergency to unite and rise up, there is no way one can start understanding any uprising and therefore the Algerian revolution itself. I have tried to write elsewhere in an article published in Political Theology that the colonial state, and perhaps any kind of modern state, could be seen as deploying a particular kind of deafness. I want to propose here today that one of the ways of considering, analyzing the aesthetics or the intersections between the aesthetics and the political today is precisely to try and think about the Algerian uprising as a way of responding to this deafness, which of course is something paradoxical because you don't respond to deafness. You don't dialogue with deafness. What you do is that you assume and act through the impossibility of dialogue, precisely. And one has to remember, of course, that freedom of expression doesn't mean anything if one cannot be heard. So there is a silence in this uprising, but the silence of the uprising, that is to say, stop dialogue, at some point at least, or provisionally, is precisely the voice of the uprising. Because this voice was speaking to someone else than France, to what now we call the global south, but I would dare saying, speaking to the world itself, to another humanity, to those who wanted to think, act, and feel otherwise, to the world, in fact, to the very extent that France was losing the world at the time, probably it is still losing the world, and one had to show the extent to which France, precisely as long as it was and wanted to remain a colonial empire, was in fact provincial. I said earlier on that an uprising was more than simply a revolution, and let me maybe say why, or at least deploy other reasons why I think about this discrepancy between Thawra and revolution. The uprising, or the very fact of rising up, is a movement. And it is precisely this movement that Abdul Qadir describes as a wave. By using the image of a passage in Africa, an interesting way of sort of pointing towards the sort of ontological inconsistency of colonialism. And it's also a movement in this particular case of uniting oneself to precisely the other movements that we call as moderns natural. Because in the same sentence, Abdulkader actually says that he's going to fight against the French army, which in fact called itself the African Army, not only, through guerrilla, but by letting nature or the environment do the rest of the work. Negativity, or the modern language of negativity, in my view, is suspended by Abdulkader, precisely because the uprising here is not about living in opposition to the colonial order, and it is much more than simply decolonization, a self-dissolving word, in my view. It is premised upon a notion of aliveness connected to the forces of the earth and the heavens, the cosmos and the metaphysical. And this aliveness is precisely what both secular and religious moderns poorly translate as religion. But there is something else about uprising or rising up, is that uprising, as I said, is a movement, and as a movement, it is physical. And let me explain why I want to insist and emphasize this bodily aspect. I have no immediate experience of the Algerian Revolution. The only direct experience I have is precisely, as many others in this room, an experience of the Hirak, by which we refer to the massive movement of protest which happened just before COVID-19 and reclaiming the abolition of the military regime as well as a real democracy and a real independence for the people of Algeria. My experience of the Hirak, this is what I wanted to talk about, is quite simple. I came, like many others, I suppose, with the idea that I would understand something about the movement, right? Through this sort of caricature of the intellectual coming in a place and trying to analyze the revolutionary movement, And by analyzing the social composition, the classes, the aims, how they organize, as if someone external would have anything more to say or more interesting to say than the actors themselves, right? Well, precisely what I've learned is that I had nothing more to say than the actors themselves. I only had to listen. Among the many sentences that were proclaimed was, "The people want independence," in different forms. I'm translating in quite a contestable way. We're all Amazigh or Imaziran, which refers to the indigenous population of North Africa. And last but not least, the civil state is not a military state. What I did learn from this experience was that something struck me as a sensible body, and not as an intellectual. Because as we know, probably, one starts thinking precisely when one ceases to intellectualize, and this is precisely what happened to me. What happened was that I was surrounded by rhythms and voices. I only have a very short trace of that because of the fact that I lost the other traces and the other archives. But precisely because we've been seeing images and images, I wanted to show something else, which is this. Okay, so this is in the middle of the street, and I'm in the middle of, this collective. It's a very short, it's 20 seconds. It's a very short passage, but many things happen. And if you don't disagree, I will put it again. End of the slideshow, click to wait. I don't remember what's there it is. Okay, so let's do it. Okay, so it's a sort of transitional moment where you can see that, I mean, what they say is "Shab yurid al-istiqlal," is the people demand independence, which, you know, probably refers to the sort of trans-historical main demand of different events that we're talking about. But what is interesting is that it's a transitional moment because you can see that they're sort of searching for the rhythm to go with the voices precisely, and by sort of going back to this very physical experience of this uprising, I want to sort of emphasize something which, at least in my view, was not at all what I was expecting to think about these uprisings, is precisely the musical element of what we call an uprising. By element, I mean the element in which something exists. That is to say that music, that sound, that rhythms, that voices are the element in which uprising actually deploys itself and exists ontologically. I would tend to say music, sound, voices, rhythm, and not only violence, as Fanon would put it. This is also why you probably guessed since then that I wanted to show this particular picture, this one, of three, in fact, not really three, there are four, but there is someone hidden in the back who's actually able to play because the other ones are probably not. So three people, I'm going to say a few things about that, but I'm sure Safia will have other things to say, because I wanted to sort of go in the margins, go beyond the sort of, the sort of straightforward, heroic sort of visions of the revolution. From what from what I know from talking to Safia, she actually told me that this precisely were the kind of gatherings, concerts, which were in fact happening during the revolution, including revolutionaries themselves, in fact. And it's interesting to see something which, in my view, is difficult to archive because it doesn't refer to something which is primarily visual, right? Neither does it refer to something which seems to be, at least, primarily political, right? But the fact of pointing towards the voice, or what I would tend to call vocal gestures, is that when we think about uprisings as revolutions, and when we think about uprisings in terms of what they claim or what they declare, we tend to focus on what only a small fraction of revolutionary actors are able to say by translating a movement, a multiplicity of voices, into words such as nation, independence. And those words, I want to insist, are important strategically, politically, but fundamentally they are abstractions in the sense that they help translate a movement within a particular language. And I would tend to say, precisely because they're trying to counter the language of hegemony by speaking the language of the hegemony, they deploy acts of counter-translation. But I don't think, or at least this is what I want to suggest, that we understand the meaning of the declarations of independence without understanding the vocal gestures through which precisely these declarations are embodied. I also wanted to refer to something that we saw yesterday during the screening, is this sort of interesting inequality of voices and precisely the sound elements of these different films. It was interesting to see that something that characterizes, these the colonial movie propaganda is precisely the silence of natives, and I mean so-called natives, contrasting with the chants precisely that are everywhere in the revolutionary documentaries. I want to sort of, end on a few, hypothetical ideas about let's say about community and state formations, as far as the very question of decolonization is concerned. I think one of the things I understood from your talk, Ariela, was precisely the fact that, and you find this at the very beginning of the Wretched of the Earth, this tension is already at stake. That is to say, the fact that it's difficult to say that the telos of decolonizing movements, of decolonizations, was the fact of building a nation state, right? Precisely, there are many dimensions, and maybe we're talking about that since yesterday, dimensions of what we call decolonizing movements, which precisely are irreducible to the sort of teleological orientation towards building a state, right? Which of course shows that independence is not reducible, at least immediately, to sovereignty, right? But in the meantime, and this is a real sort of paradox, not just a theoretical paradox, how is it possible to even imagine something such as decolonization and, to engage in such a struggle in a world precisely which is, in which independence takes immediately the form of the nation state? How is it possible to just imagine decolonization without this telos, right? So I think that there is a real tension in this, and this is precisely a political question, but it's also, in many respects, an analytical and a conceptual question. I mean, I'm going to try and sort of clarify why I think it's an important question. Is that precisely I was referring to the Sumam, the text of the Sumam Congress, which oftentimes we call the first constitution of the Algerian state. But precisely when the Congress was held, what was at stake, what was in precisely, I would tend to say, in a movement, right, was not exactly what we call a nation state, right? It was a dynamic, it was an organized guerrilla. In other words, it was a movement of uprising, a collective movement of uprising, which means that precisely there was something about what happened which was not immediately pointing towards the foundation of a nation state as we know it now. I referred to the fact that the language of the text does not refer, at least not primarily, to the language of equal liberty. I was mentioning justice, liberation, dignity, all referring to an action of uniting against the colonizers, also by dividing the divisions created by the colonizers. But there is also something about the ethical dimension of the revolution, which is interesting to the extent that the text immediately mentions the capacity of the revolutionaries to nurture certain virtues and to act conformingly, right? Which refers to the ethical in this sense. And as someone who's partly trained in what we call political philosophy, I was trying to think about what the categories were. I mean, what the categories that we could use to think about the kind of community that was at stake. What were the categories that we could use, right, from the tradition, of thought that we call political philosophy. And certainly the territorial nation state was not part of the option. And what I remembered, in fact, was two texts I want to talk about. Of course, I could mention The Wretched of the Earth, because there are many things very interesting that Fanon writes about the dialectical interactions between the state party and the people. That would be, sort of the obvious reference, right? But I want to introduce two other references. The first one, I think I already in fact mentioned it without mentioning it, is what Marx wrote about the commune, precisely. And what is interesting is that what happens at the time within the Marxist language is the fact that he's trying to think about a state which is not yet a state, or a state which is a quasi-state, right? And this precisely is a commune. But the other, this is why I was mentioning the fact that this constitution is probably a communal constitution. But the other reference I want to mention, which is quite odd in different ways, but very classical, is Plato, the Republic. If one reactualizes some of the passages of the Republic, what seems to me striking is that precisely from this perspective, faithfulness to a revolution or an uprising is also, in fact, faithfulness to a certain sound and a certain rhythmical practice. In fact, this idea, as strange as it may sound to some of you, has in fact a profound philosophical dignity and a profound philosophical history, which precisely starts with Plato, and which, in my view, has been ignored by many philosophers, if not most of them, especially since, Descartes and so on, is that precisely for Plato, and you find this in Farabi, that rhythm is not only something subjective, it is something cosmic which shapes the self and, in fact, the citizen through music and dance, or rather what we call now music and dance, because at the time it was different forms of practices. And precisely this rhythm for Plato is nothing else but justice. It means that justice is not something abstract, but that there is a capacity for justice, something which probably was lost and disappeared as soon as politics was separate from ethics, that is, from the ways one does and feels certain things. Let me just conclude by going back to this photograph, because what they hold in their hand is a particular kind of instrument, which is called a bendir. Some of you, might know this instrument, which looks like this. This is a bendir. And I just want to say that this something about this instrument is interesting, and I would like to talk about that a little bit as a open-ended conclusion. So I've been writing about questions of secularism, and so on. And at some point, there was these sort of debates, very academic debates about, okay, but what should we do if the secular and the religious is a false binary, blah, blah, and so on. And I just want to give a very simple, sensible, in all possible meanings of the word, response to this debate. This instrument, in fact, is both profane and sacred, and to some extent, it's none of them, right? This is a Sufi instrument, that is to say, you can use it by in order to sort of reach states of consciousness that in fact allow you to reach other dimensions of reality that we as modern have erased. But in the meantime, it's also a popular instrument used precisely to do what we've been doing since yesterday, that is to say, to celebrate. So precisely through the usage of this instrument, which, I guess we have a sort of visual trace here, the boundary between the secular and the religious vanishes, as well as the boundaries between what we call life and arts, aesthetics and ethics, aesthetics and politics. My last word is simply that which was probably going to sound a bit too metaphysical for some of you, but it's already been a bit the case, so let's go for it. Is that there is an ongoing problem, abstract in a ways, but in fact very concrete in many other ways, which has to do with what I was trying to call the erasure or the limitations of negativity. If you read a very important text that we didn't talk about, and maybe it was a good thing not to mention this text, is the foreword or the preface written by Sartre to the Wretched of the Earth. And what Sartre does in this text is something philosophically very interesting, but very problematic, is precisely that he says he uses a very typical Hegelian concept to talk about what Fanon is thinking about by trying, in fact, to reduce the Algerian Revolution to a Hegelian concept, which is the concept of negativity. That is to say, the colonized have been negated by the colonizer, right? So if you're negated by colonialism, and then you respond to colonialism, you negate a negation, right? Which precisely is an interesting operation to the extent that it's philosophically, of course, indebted to the West, but more importantly, so it was for Hegel at least a way of rationalizing Christianity, right? And there are places in the Fanonian text which are also, who are passages which are very ambiguous, where in fact he quotes a passage of the Bible, "The last shall be the first," to sort of describe the essence of decolonization, which is very interesting from the point of view of a revolution, or at least of a thinker who thought of them himself as secular. So the last thing I want to say, which in my view is a very important question, is, and not in fact as abstract as one would think, is that one of the flaws, one of the limitations of this language, despite the fact that, apart from the fact that it's Western, imperial, colonial, Christian, whatever you want to say, it's the fact that it refers to an oppositional dimension of anti-colonial movements, and it imprisons these movements in an oppositional mode, which means that they live only in a response and exist only as a response to the violence that they've been subjected to. Which means that there is at least one element which is missing in this language, which is the element of creation in all possible words. So this is what I wanted to point to, and to an element which I think is quite unarchivable. So, and this will be the end of my talk and the opening of the Q&A sessions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Good afternoon. My name is Kate Creasy. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History here at Brown and an affiliate with the Center for Middle East Studies. Adel has generously asked me to moderate the concluding Q&A panel. I would like to invite Sophie and Mohammed to join me at the table. So we'll keep this informal in the style that we've done today. I thought I would start by making a comment, Mohammed, about your paper, and Sophie posing a question to you, and then you can both respond if you'd like, and then we can open the floor up to questions and comments from the audience. I'm not a historian of Algeria, though many of my interlocutors work on Algeria. I am a historian of contemporary Turkey and sort of visual material from the 1980s in Turkey. But I've been thinking about photographs for a long time, and one of the people that I've been fortunate enough to be in conversation with is the South African photographer Omar Bacha, who was an important trade unionist during the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s and did a lot of documentary photography work. He was an important sort of Black photographer of the anti-apartheid struggle. And one of the things that So Mohammed, this is directed to you. I think there's an invitation in your work that's very important, which is to think about the images that we're looking at of revolution, not just as images, but as multisensorial objects, as objects that represent an array of possible sensorial experiences. The way we access this is through the visual, but that, I think your juxtaposition in your talk of the image with the sound recording was an invitation to sort of think about the range of experiences that photographs can offer us beyond, the kind of Cartesian visual plane. And I bring Omar Badshah's work up because in conversation with him, I wish I had one of his photographs to show, but he would often, show these like trade union movement meetings, or he would show sort of funeral processions or strikes, and there was always an element of choreography in his photograph that you could sort of not only hear what was happening when you looked at the photograph, but there was also a kind of physicality, an invitation, a kind of an anticipation. And one of the things he said about this was that he produced these very deliberately so that when people looked at them, they would have some sense of, if they were in that position, what would they do? What physically would they do if they were in that position? We haven't, talked beyond Algeria, but there's some interesting resonances between Algeria and South Africa, and certainly Algeria is a reference point for a lot of people in South Africa about sort of what didn't happen there. So thinking about the ways in which we understand photographs as kind of multisensorial objects that can be activated in different kinds of ways. I appreciated that intervention. Sophia, I had a question for you that came out of our conversation this morning. I was really interested, or I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the El Mujahid newspaper archive. And in particular, I was interested in your PowerPoint presentation. I think there was a slide with a quote about women being willing to sacrifice themselves, and wanted to give you a chance to sort of reflect on how you might connect this to the idea of the Algerian woman as an example, but not an exceptional figure per se.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, if you'd like to respond, you're welcome to go first.
I thought it was just a comment, so and not a question. So
it was, but if it prompted some thought or reflection to share.
To you. Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. But I must say, I'm not a. there is this partly a.
If you can just,
sure.
If you can just speak to the microphone,
yes.
So for those live streaming.
I'm not a visual person, I've always been wary of doing something which, at some point, I wanted to do, which was to sort of practice. Do a dissertation which would have been something more closer to what we call the philosophy of art, or to do what is called sort of a practice-based theory, which I didn't want to do because I didn't want to sort of use discourse as a way of making sense of an artistic practice, but rather to create a certain kind of discourse. And I'm still in the process, and it's completely in the making, and it's difficult because it's risky and so on, but no risks means nothing interesting in my view. Precisely to construct or deploy a philosophical, intellectual discourse which can resonate as if it was a translation of a language into another, into a musical or sound language, by sort of resisting the temptation to go there, what I noticed was that, and this is not a criticism at all, it's just something I noticed, which is that there is a certain, I mean, probably people will have other opinions, but that there is a certain ritual which is already sort of organized of how intellectuals and artists can collaborate, as long as we're talking about visuality. I mean, images. Sometimes it's moving images. It's, of course, film is of course multi-sensorial, as you said. But I was interested in precisely theorizing the invisible, right? By which I not only mean, of course, the invisible as in the metaphysical sense, but also the fact, how do we theorize about something we can't see? Obviously, it has been said and argued that there is a primacy, that the West or modern West deploys a primacy of the eye towards the other senses. Over the other senses, which probably is true. And if it's true, I think it also organizes the ways in which theory and the art sort of enter in conversation. So I'm just trying to sort of bring performance in which, of course, many people did already, but most of the time it's not about collaborating between theory and performative arts. It's using theory to think about performance, right, which is something else and not something I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sophia?
Sure. So thanks so much for your question, Kate. Maybe I'll start by giving a little bit of context about the Al Mujahid archive. So this is an archive that has been difficult in many ways to get a hold of because the holdings are so scattered. You go to one archive and there are just these sort of lacunes, there are these gaps. So I've been spending, the past couple of months trying to put these together, and in doing so, I noticed certain patterns about the way that the Mujahidat, the female freedom fighters, were represented. So in the slideshow, I showed a picture of Jamila Boupasha, and I didn't really talk about it. Is it helpful if I put it back on the screen?
I think, I think we
might not have time for it.
Yeah, we can just continue.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So basically, in this article where Jamila Boupasha's image is used, Boupasha is named as one of many, many, many women in the revolution. And the point is to say that, she is a notable historical figure, but at the same time, there were many women who were like her. And this echoes, rhetoric that is used elsewhere in Al Mujahid, like in France Fanon's article about Jamila Bouhairid, where he talks about there being multiple Jamila Bouhairid. Il y a de multiples Jamila Bouhairid qui ont été torturées. So this really fits into the FLN's drive to look at these particular examples and assimilate them into this narrative of un seul héros, le peuple. And I will say one more thing about the film that I mentioned briefly in my presentation, Jamila, the Algerian woman, Gamila al-Ghazariya by Youssef Chahine in 1958. So this film was actually banned in Algeria precisely because it did go against this narrative of un seul héros, le peuple, one single hero, the people, because Jamila was made out to be this kind of exceptional hero. So I'll just end on that note.
Thank you. We'll open it up now if there are questions or comments from the audience. Yeah, Ariella?
Yes, so thank you.
Wait, we'll just get a mic to you. Thanks. Perfect.
Thank you for really great presentations. I really enjoy them a lot. And I have a question. One of them maybe relate both of the presentations, and one with which I start is directed to you, Muhammad. You articulated this tension that we have to dwell in, that not necessarily any liberation project will end up or should end up, or I don't know, with a nation state. But on the other hand, we know how the independence is actually maybe in this particular world that we live in, leads finally to a nation state. And I wonder, you know, this is something that I asked Adel several times when he showed me the photographs, these 4 photographs taken, you know, in this chateau in France. And I wondered about the way that the colonizers trained Algerians to actually all the time divert into a nation state, because there were many options, right? And we see that at the end there is a training. So the Evian is for sure training. When you read the protocol, they really train them to unreservedly, you know, adhere to the droit de l'homme, etc. But I wonder always about, you know, this kidnapping them, actually. The Gaul want to save them. Why does he want to save them? Why does he want to hold them so many years in France, if not for training them in a way? Because it seems like, you know, from the photographs, like they are in vacation. And they are not in vacation, they are arrested. So something about the training, if you can think about the training, as something that can help us think this tension. And the other question that I wanted to address, somehow I see some similarities. You called it radical deafness about, you know, the colonizers or the colonial state. And you speak about, you know, the uprising, the Tahora, as the moment when they withdraw from speaking back to this, you know, colonial deafness. And they are speaking to each other, they're speaking to the global south, etc., etc. And I'm thinking about, you know, Sophia, about this situation. It's better? Okay, thank you. About this situation when these women that work together with others in a space that is disconnected from speaking to the French, and all of a sudden they are in this kind of tiny salon, sitting on the same couch with this guy, all these men, all these, you know, probably French, maybe some of them are Europeans. All of a sudden they have to speak to them, and they are dressed in a way that it's really not very comfortable to be with so many men in the same space. So there is something about their discomfort that I would like to ask you to reflect about, you know, in connection to Muhammad's lecture, about all of a sudden being, you know, forced or thrown into the situation that they have to speak to them in such an intimacy with their bodies is so. And one tiny question, Muhammad, to you, a variant on this question. I understand the radical deafness, and I think it's very generative as a term, but I wonder if there is not another way to speak about it from the point of view of the colonizers, that they are actually demagnetizing themselves from the way that the colonizers force itself to be the voice to which, you know, or the presence to which you address. So.
Sure. Yeah. Sophia, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much, Professor Azoulay, for your question. Ariella, Aisha. So yeah, I mean, so this sensation of discomfort was the first thing that seized me when I was looking at the series of photographs. It was a sort of punctum, as Barthes calls it, in La Chambre Claire. And that discomfort is made so obvious in their facial expressions as well as their body language. And I was thinking about the presence of these reporters as well, you know, all of whom were men. And I was really drawn to Bouhaired in particular in the way that she looks away from the camera and that she looks at this reporter's notebook as if she's very concerned about what's being written about her. And I was thinking about, you know, these women have been given a forum in which they can speak, but they don't have complete control over how that voice gets warped and how that's going to be transformed and translated in the press, and even how something like their images, so photographs taken of them, are going to be interpreted and used in a certain way, and they have very little control over that. So this is something that I see them as being very aware of. Of course, the three women react to it in a very different way. I think Zora Drif shows herself as the one who's really the most comfortable being in the limelight. You rarely see her in moments of discomfort, and she has been someone who, you know, regularly, elle prend toujours la parole, in contrast to the other, you know, two women. So I think, you know, thinking through these photos through the lens of discomfort is really productive in thinking about how this kind of singular narrative, this dominant narrative of history actually erases that ambivalence.
Okay. So there are two questions. Training, deafness. If it was just the accord d'Évian, and I think we would have to talk more about that, because I was also really intrigued by what you said about the importance of the accord d'Évian in sort of trying to impose a certain kind of language, right? But what I can say from what I know now is that it's difficult to sort of think, either it was a nation state, and if it was not, what would it be? Because for sure they would have, implemented a state, right? And it's of course not just, of course this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it. But all countries in the global south organized as a nation state. So this is of course a global question of which relate to why do we have nation states and where did they come from, which presupposes a critical history of the West, or what we call the modern West, and in my view of secularization. But this is another problem. But what I want to say is that instead of responding by saying the nation state or what else, the alternative would be to think about what alternative kind of state, or maybe alternative kind of nation state, could have emerged, right? Because there is someone we didn't talk about who's not in the photographs because of historical contingencies, whose name is Aben Ramdan, right? Who was very important in the organization of the Congress, the Sumam Congress. And what is interesting in this text is that it refers to Algeria as an Algerian Algeria, meaning something that doesn't exist in most countries in the West, or most liberal democracies, which is the idea of a nation which is a plurality of nation, right? A plural nation, both African and Arab, or both Amazigh or North African and Arab. The other obvious difference, so this, first of all, I'm going to talk more about that, because I was going to jump to some other point, but this is already something maybe to analyze a bit more in details. What happened, in my view, this is probably a contestable perspective on the events, but there are only contestable perspectives on the events, in my view, is that as precisely the declaration of the Sumam Congress was being betrayed in a way, right? That is to say that there was a primacy of the military over the civil state. There also was an increasing definition of Algeria as an Arab nation, right? Which is contestable. Because if you look at the first moments of the revolution, what was at stake was a dual nation, at least dual, plural nation, right? I think that if this democratic demand would have succeeded, then even at this stage, even without mentioning, what would it be, Rojava or something, very alternative, this would already be something else, right? That is to say, the possibility for a nation to define itself equally as, in this instance, as North African and Arab, right? This would have been already something new on the face of the earth, right? Now, the extent to which, and this is a question mark, and maybe we can talk more about that, the Accord d'Évian also participated in the definition of Algeria as an Arab nation is an open-ended question. Of course, the influence of Nasser and Pan-Arabism is probably much more at stake here. But this is the first thing I wanted to add. Our time is up. So
There's a difference, right? Like conversation.
that's right. And deafness, we'll talk about that a bit more. But I take your point.
Please join me in thanking
you.
Sophia and Mohammed for their papers. Adel, are you coming up for some final words?
Two words.
Okay.
That will be 5 words. Just thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming for these past 2 days. Thank you for coming to film screening. Thank you for not screaming at me for all the emails I've sent you over the past few weeks. I see you, Ahmed. And this was very. I'm really excited about what was generated today, and I hope that this is just sort of like a starting point to continue having this conversation, thinking about this question, and producing work around Algeria, independence, decolonization, revolution. So thank you very much. One word from Professor Dobi, very quickly, to say that things continue.
Thank you, Adel.
I really thought that Adel should have absolutely the last word, but he's insisting that I speak about things continuing, and indeed they will and they must. So the conversations will start again at Columbia Tuesday, 5 p.m. We have a wonderful panel on traces of memory and visual culture, led by Mariana Hirsch, with wonderful younger scholars of Algerian literature, film, history. And Zainab Chelik, who's an older Columbia professor who works on the history of architecture. So we have that event. We're going to have another conversation between Adel and Safia and Mariam. So I can't say how moved I've been by their testimony and how much I look forward to that continuing conversation. And then we have a longer version of Olivier Hadoushi's curated film series, split into 2 parts, and then 2 virtual panels, one of which will be about politics and contemporary visual culture, and the other will focus more on the question of popular politics from the Thawra to the Hirak. So if you can come in person, please do. If you want to attend the virtual events, that would be great too. And thank you again so much to Adel for being the leader, the inspiration of this series of events. Thank you, Safia, for your generosity in bringing us these photographs, and for your testimony as well. And thank you to all the team here at Brown, and to all the speakers.